Welcome, young wizard, to a tale of darkness and light, of choices that shaped the wizarding world forever. Tonight, we journey through the shadows of the First Wizarding War, a conflict that began in whispers and ended in the cry of a child who lived. As you settle into your cozy chamber, let these words carry you through the rise and fall of the darkest wizard who ever lived and the brave souls who stood against him. Close your eyes and drift into this chronicle of war and sacrifice, where every decision carried the weight of destiny. In the depths of winter, when 1926 painted the world in shades of grey and despair, a child was born who would reshape the very foundations of magical civilization. The birth took place not in the hallowed halls of Street Mungo's or within the warm embrace of a loving family home, but in the sterile corridors of Wool's Orphanage, London, where Merope Gaunt drew her final breath even as she brought forth the son who would become the most feared wizard in history. Tom Marvolo Riddle entered the world as his mother departed it, her last act of magic, ensuring his survival while her heart simply stopped beating, worn down by poverty, abandonment, and the terrible weight of loving someone who could never love her in return. The infant who lay crying in that cold December night carried within his veins the blood of Salazar Slytherin himself, though this noble heritage was tainted by generations of inbreeding and madness that had reduced the once mighty Gaunt family to little more than squatters living in squalor. His father, Tom Riddle Sr., remained blissfully unaware that his brief enchantment with a strange, plain girl had resulted in offspring. Having fled back to his comfortable life in Little Hangleton the moment Merope's love potions wore off and he saw her for what she truly was. The child was thus abandoned by both parents before he could speak his first word, left to the mercies of an institution that had little mercy to spare. Mrs. Cole, who ran the orphanage with the stern efficiency of someone who had seen too much of life's cruelties, would later remember the boy as being different from the very beginning. While other children cried for comfort or attention, young Tom's wails seemed to carry an edge of command, as if he expected the world to bend to his will, even before he understood what will meant. The nurses who tended him spoke in whispers of how his eyes seemed too knowing for an infant, too calculating, as if some ancient intelligence looked out through those dark orbs and found the world wanting. As Tom grew from infant to child, the signs of his magical heritage began to manifest in ways both subtle and terrifying. Objects would move when he was angry, appearing in places they had no business being. Other children would wake from nightmares they couldn't remember, screaming about snakes and shadows that seemed all too real. The pet rabbit that belonged to Dennis Bishop simply vanished one day after Dennis had taken a toy that Tom coveted, and though no evidence was ever found, Mrs. Cole noticed how the boy smiled when Dennis cried, a cold expression that belonged on no child's face. The other children learned to fear him without understanding why, their natural instincts recognizing a predator in their midst, even when their minds could not comprehend the nature of the threat. Tom, for his part, relished this fear, understanding even at a young age that power came not from being loved, but from being feared, that control was more valuable than affection, and that the weak deserved whatever fate the strong chose to impose upon them. He began to experiment with his abilities in ways that would have alarmed any adult who truly understood what they were witnessing. Though the staff at Wool's Orphanage dismissed such incidents as childhood pranks or overactive imaginations, the cave incident, when Tom led two younger children into the seaside caverns during an orphanage outing and returned alone, claiming that Amy Benson and Dennis Bishop had simply wandered off, marked the first time his manipulative abilities were put to serious test. The children, when found hours later, were changed in fundamental ways that no amount of questioning could explain. They spoke in whispers about hanging from the ceiling, about darkness that moved and whispered back, about things that Tom had shown them that no child should ever see. But Tom himself remained composed and helpful, offering to search for his missing companions with such apparent concern that the adults praised him for his compassion, while privately wondering why Amy and Dennis seemed so terrified whenever he was near. It was into this environment of controlled chaos and barely contained malevolence that Professor Dumbledore arrived on a grey August morning in 1938, carrying with him a letter that would change not just Tom's life but the entire course of magical history. The meeting between the greatest wizard of the age and the child who would become his greatest enemy took place in Tom's small, sparse room at the orphanage, surrounded by stolen trinkets and trophies that spoke to a nature already twisted beyond normal childhood cruelty. Dumbledore, even then possessed of the wisdom and perception that would make him legendary among his peers, saw through Tom's carefully constructed facade of charm and intelligence to the darkness that festered beneath. But he also saw potential for redemption, a possibility that love and proper guidance might yet turn this damaged child toward the light. It was perhaps the greatest tragedy of the coming war that this hope, however well-intentioned, would prove to be founded on a fundamental misunderstanding of Tom's nature. Some souls, as Dumbledore would learn too late, are born without the capacity for love or genuine human connection, and all the guidance in the world cannot create what was never there to begin with. The conversation between teacher and student that day was filled with subtle tests and careful probes, each taking the measure of the other with the instinctive wariness of natural enemies who had not yet recognized themselves as such. Tom demonstrated his magical abilities with a casualness that spoke of long familiarity, making flames dance in his palm and causing objects to move with precision that should have taken years of training to achieve. But it was the calculated way he observed Dumbledore's reactions, storing away information for future use, that truly revealed the depth of his precocious cunning. When Tom asked whether other people like him existed, his question carried layers of meaning that extended far beyond simple curiosity about the magical world. He was already thinking in terms of superiority and inferiority, of those who deserved power and those who existed merely to serve or be eliminated. The revelation that an entire society of magical beings existed merely confirmed what he had always believed about his own specialness, though it also introduced the troubling possibility that others might possess abilities equal to or greater than his own. The journey to Diagon Alley to purchase his school supplies became Tom's first real introduction to the wizarding world's complex social hierarchies and ancient prejudices. He absorbed every detail with the focused intensity of a scholar studying warfare, understanding instinctively that knowledge of these divisions would serve him well in his future plans. The distinction between pure-bloods, half-bloods, and muggle-borns particularly fascinated him, not because he felt any genuine pride in magical heritage, but because he recognized the political utility of such classifications in dividing potential opposition and recruiting followers. His wand selection at Ollivander's proved to be one of the most significant moments in magical history, though its full importance would not become clear for many years. When the 13.5-inch yew wand with a phoenix feather core chose him, Mr. Ollivander spoke prophetically of the great things Tom would accomplish, not knowing that he was placing in the hands of a future Dark Lord one of the most powerful wands ever created. The connection between Tom's wand and Harry Potter's, which shared feathers from the same phoenix, would eventually play a crucial role in Voldemort's downfall, though such ironies were still decades in the future. The train journey to Hogwarts provided Tom with his first opportunity to study his future classmates and potential allies or enemies. He moved through the carriages with the calculated charm of someone much older than his 11 years, identifying those who might be useful to him while cataloguing the weaknesses of those who might pose threats. His ability to read people and situations with supernatural accuracy was already well developed, allowing him to present different faces to different audiences, while maintaining perfect control over his true thoughts and intentions. The Sorting Hat's deliberation over Tom's placement was longer than usual, as the ancient artifact sensed depths of darkness that troubled even its centuries of experience. The Hat could perceive the enormous potential for both creation and destruction that lay within the boy's mind, understanding that his intelligence and ambition could reshape the wizarding world, for better or worse, depending on the choices he would make. In the end, Slytherin House claimed him not because of any genuine pride in magical heritage, but because his cunning and ruthless pragmatism marked him as a natural heir to Salazar Slytherin's philosophy. His early years at Hogwarts were marked by a carefully orchestrated campaign of charm and manipulation that established him as one of the most promising students in the school's history. Teachers who should have recognized the warning signs were instead dazzled by his brilliance and apparent dedication to learning, failing to understand that his thirst for knowledge was motivated not by genuine curiosity, but by an insatiable hunger for power. He excelled in every subject, but his particular fascination with defense against the dark arts and the more theoretical aspects of magic revealed interests that extended far beyond academic achievement. The formation of his inner circle began almost immediately upon his arrival at Hogwarts, as Tom identified those students whose family connections, magical abilities, or personal weaknesses made them valuable additions to his growing network of influence. These early followers, who would later form the core of the Knights of Walpurgis and eventually evolve into the Death Eaters, were drawn to him by a combination of his charismatic leadership and their own desires for power, acceptance, or protection from the school's social hierarchies. Abraxas Malfoy, heir to one of the oldest and wealthiest pure-blood families, became one of Tom's most valuable allies, not because of any genuine friendship, but because of the political and financial resources his family could provide. The elder Malfoy saw in Tom a kindred spirit who shared his contempt for those of inferior blood, not understanding that Tom's prejudices were based on utility rather than genuine belief. Lestrange, Nott, Mulciber, and others gathered around Tom like moths drawn to a flame, each believing himself to be a trusted confidant, while serving merely as expendable tools in a larger design. The teachers at Hogwarts, with the notable exception of Professor Dumbledore, were systematically charmed by Tom's apparent dedication to learning and his unfailingly polite demeanor. Professor Slughorn, in particular, became one of Tom's most important sources of dangerous knowledge, sharing information about Horcruxes and other dark magic that should never have been revealed to any student, regardless of their apparent brilliance or trustworthiness. These conversations, conducted in the cozy atmosphere of Slughorn's office over crystallized pineapple and expensive wine, would provide Tom with the theoretical foundation for his greatest and most terrible magical achievement. It was during his second year at Hogwarts that Tom made his first attempt to create a Horcrux, though the full horror of this act would not be revealed until decades later, when the Chamber of Secrets was finally opened and its monster set loose upon the school. The murder of Myrtle Warren, accomplished through the basilisk that had slumbered in the chamber for centuries, was both a test of Tom's ability to command the monster and a means of splitting his soul for the first time. The creation of his diary as a Horcrux represented not just the preservation of a fragment of his soul, but the beginning of his systematic pursuit of immortality through the darkest possible means. The opening of the Chamber of Secrets and the subsequent attacks on Muggle-born students revealed the depth of Tom's strategic thinking and his willingness to sacrifice innocent lives to achieve his goals. He orchestrated the crisis with the skill of a master manipulator, appearing to be deeply concerned about the safety of his fellow students, while secretly controlling the very monster that threatened them. His framing of Hagrid for the attacks demonstrated both his tactical cunning and his complete lack of moral constraint, showing that he was willing to destroy the life of someone who had shown him nothing but kindness if it served his purposes. The recruitment of the basilisk to his cause required not just the ability to speak Parseltongue, inherited from his Slytherin ancestry, but a fundamental understanding of dark creatures and their motivations that went far beyond anything taught in regular classes. Tom spent countless hours in the Chamber of Secrets, learning to communicate with and control the ancient serpent while exploring the deeper mysteries of Salazar Slytherin's magical legacy. These sessions provided him with insights into the nature of dark magic that would prove invaluable in his later transformation into Lord Voldemort. His academic performance during these years was nothing short of extraordinary, earning him praise from professors who failed to understand the true purpose behind his scholarly pursuits. Every essay he wrote, every spell he mastered, every piece of magical theory he absorbed was carefully evaluated for its potential contribution to his growing understanding of power and its applications. He approached magic not as an art or science to be appreciated for its own sake, but as a collection of tools to be used in the pursuit of dominance over others. The prefect badge he received in his 5th year was both a recognition of his apparent leadership qualities and a strategic asset that provided him with additional authority over his fellow students. He used this position not to maintain order and fairness as intended, but to further his own agenda, protecting his followers from consequences while subtly punishing those who opposed or threatened his growing influence. The younger students who served under his authority learned to fear his displeasure more than they respected his rank, understanding instinctively that crossing Tom Riddle carried consequences that extended far beyond official school discipline. Professor Dumbledore's growing suspicion of Tom's true nature created a tension that permeated their every interaction, though neither wizard was yet ready to acknowledge the full implications of their mutual wariness. Dumbledore began to watch Tom more closely, noting inconsistencies in his behavior and reactions that suggested depths of calculation and coldness that no normal student should possess. But his attempts to guide Tom toward a better path were hampered by the boy's extraordinary ability to present different faces to different audiences, maintaining his reputation as a model student while pursuing increasingly dark interests in private. The acquisition of additional knowledge about Horcruxes and other forms of dark magic occupied much of Tom's attention during his later years at Hogwarts, as he laid the groundwork for the magical experiments that would eventually transform him into something beyond normal human limitations. His conversations with Professor Slughorn about the theoretical possibilities of splitting one's soul multiple times revealed ambitions that should have alarmed any responsible adult. But Slughorn's vanity and desire to be associated with brilliant students blinded him to the implications of Tom's questions. The careful cultivation of his public image reached its pinnacle when Tom was appointed head boy in his 7th year, a position that provided him with unprecedented access to areas of the castle that were normally forbidden to students. He used this authority to explore Hogwarts' deepest secrets, uncovering magical knowledge and artifacts that had been hidden for centuries. His midnight wanderings through the castle's most restricted sections provided him with insights into defensive magic and ancient spells that would prove invaluable in his future conquests. The global wizarding war that raged throughout Tom's time at Hogwarts, led by the dark wizard Grindelwald, served as both inspiration and cautionary tale for the young man who would eventually surpass his predecessor in every measure of terror and destruction. Tom studied Grindelwald's methods and philosophy with the analytical detachment of a military strategist, identifying the strengths and weaknesses that had allowed the Dark Wizard to achieve such widespread influence, while ultimately failing to achieve complete victory. Professor Dumbledore's eventual confrontation with Grindelwald in 1945 provided Tom with his first clear demonstration of the limits of dark magic when faced with someone of equal or greater power guided by moral principles. The duel between the two greatest wizards of their generation was legendary, not just for its magical complexity, but for its emotional depth, as Dumbledore was forced to defeat someone he had once loved. Tom observed the aftermath of this conflict with keen interest, understanding that power alone was insufficient if one's opponents possessed advantages in knowledge, experience, or moral conviction. The acquisition of the Elder Wand by Professor Dumbledore following his victory over Grindelwald added another layer of complexity to Tom's long-term strategic planning, as he recognized that obtaining the most powerful wand in existence would be essential to his ultimate goals. The knowledge that such a weapon existed and was possessed by the one wizard he had come to recognize as a potential threat shaped much of his thinking about the challenges he would face in his rise to power. His graduation from Hogwarts in 1945 marked the end of Tom Riddle's official existence and the beginning of his transformation into Lord Voldemort, though this process would take decades to complete and would require sacrifices that would strip away every vestige of his humanity. The young man who left Hogwarts carrying the highest grades in the school's history was already planning conquests that would make Grindelwald's ambitions seem modest by comparison, though he was wise enough to understand that achieving such goals would require patience, preparation, and a willingness to pay prices that few would dare to contemplate. The foundations of the First Wizarding War were thus laid, not in grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but in the quiet corruption of a brilliant child whose capacity for love had been destroyed before he was old enough to understand what he was losing. Tom Marvolo Riddle's transformation into Lord Voldemort began in a London orphanage and was completed in the halls of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, where the greatest educational institution in the magical world inadvertently provided him with both the knowledge and connections he would need to nearly destroy everything it represented. The silence that followed Tom Riddle's departure from Hogwarts in 1945 was not the peaceful quiet of a world at rest, but the ominous stillness that precedes the most devastating storms. As the wizarding world celebrated the end of Grindelwald's reign of terror and looked forward to an era of rebuilding and reconciliation, the young man who would become Lord Voldemort vanished into the shadows like smoke dissipating in the wind, leaving behind only whispered rumors and half-remembered fears among those who had known him best. His disappearance was so complete and systematic that it seemed almost supernatural, as if Tom Riddle had simply ceased to exist rather than merely choosing to avoid detection. The few attempts made by former classmates or teachers to maintain contact with their brilliant peer met with failure so absolute that many began to wonder if something terrible had befallen him. Letters went unanswered, inquiries met with blank stares from people who should have known his whereabouts, and even the most persistent efforts to track him through magical means yielded nothing but dead ends and false leads. In truth, Tom had embarked upon a journey that would take him to the darkest corners of the magical world, seeking knowledge and artifacts that existed in the spaces between legend and nightmare. His quest for the remaining Founder's artifacts began with Helga Hufflepuff's cup and Salazar Slytherin's locket, items whose magical properties had been enhanced by centuries of reverence and the accumulated power of their original owners. But finding these treasures required more than simple research or gold to purchase them from willing sellers. The trail of Helga Hufflepuff's cup led him first through dusty archives and forgotten family histories, tracing the ownership of the artifact through generations of collectors and inheritors who had possessed it without truly understanding its significance. Each lead required careful investigation and often dangerous encounters with magical families who guarded their secrets with spells that had been passed down through bloodlines older than recorded history. Tom navigated these challenges with the patience of someone who understood that true power was worth waiting decades to obtain. The search took him to Albania, a land where ancient magic still flowed through forests that had never known the touch of civilization, where creatures from the earliest days of the magical world still roamed free, and the barriers between life and death were thinner than anywhere else on Earth. In those primordial woodlands, Tom encountered magical phenomena that challenged even his extraordinary understanding of theoretical possibilities, experiences that would later inform his experiments with immortality and the manipulation of souls. It was among the twisted trees and mist-shrouded valleys of Albania that Tom first encountered the shade of Ravenclaw's diadem, hidden in a place where Helena Ravenclaw's tortured spirit had concealed it centuries earlier. The recovery of this artifact required not just magical skill, but a willingness to delve into forms of necromancy that pushed the boundaries of what even dark wizards typically dared attempt. His communion with the Grey Lady's shade taught him secrets about the nature of death and the persistence of consciousness beyond physical destruction that would prove invaluable in his later creation of Horcruxes. The years from 1945 to 1949 were spent in this painstaking archaeological work, as Tom systematically located and claimed artifacts that had been lost to history or hidden by their owners to prevent their misuse. Each acquisition required not just the defeat of protective spells and guardian creatures, but the elimination of witnesses who might reveal his activities to those who would oppose his growing collection of powerful magical items. The murders that marked this period of his life were carried out with clinical precision and strategic purpose, each death serving multiple functions in his larger plan, while leaving no traces that could be followed by investigators. Tom had learned from studying Grindelwald's eventual downfall that leaving survivors who could testify about one's methods was a weakness that more careful planning could eliminate. His victims simply vanished, their disappearances attributed to everything from magical accidents to voluntary exile, while their most precious possessions found their way into Tom's growing collection. His employment at Borgin & Burke's beginning around 1950 provided him with the perfect cover for his continued artifact hunting, as his position in the Dark Arts Emporium gave him access to both rare magical items and the clients who sought to buy or sell them. The shop's reputation for discretion and its clientele's preference for anonymity created an environment where Tom could conduct his research and negotiations without attracting unwanted attention from ministry officials or other legitimate authorities. Caractacus Burke and Mr. Borgin, the shop's proprietors, were impressed by their young employee's extensive knowledge of magical artifacts and his uncanny ability to identify fake items or determine the true value of pieces that other experts had dismissed as worthless. They had no idea that Tom's expertise came from years of illegal excavation and theft, or that his charming manner with difficult customers masked a complete willingness to kill anyone who stood between him and his goals. The relationship Tom cultivated with Hepzibah Smith during this period demonstrated both his patience as a long-term strategist and his complete lack of moral constraint when it came to exploiting the weaknesses of others. The elderly witch, whose wealth and collection of magical artifacts made her a valuable target, was gradually seduced by Tom's combination of youthful charm and apparent fascination with her stories about the magical treasures she had inherited from her ancestors. For over a decade, Tom maintained the pretense of genuine affection and interest in Hepzibah's welfare, visiting her regularly and listening with apparent rapt attention to her rambling tales about the history of her various magical possessions. He brought her small gifts and tokens of esteem that cost him little but meant everything to a lonely old woman who had few visitors and fewer friends. His performance was so convincing that even Hepzibah's house elf, Hoki, came to regard him as a devoted friend whose visits brought joy to her mistress's otherwise solitary existence. The revelation of Helga Hufflepuff's cup and Salazar Slytherin's locket in Hepzibah's collection represented the culmination of years of patient cultivation. As Tom finally laid eyes on two of the four Founders' artifacts he had been seeking since leaving Hogwarts, his reaction to seeing these legendary items was carefully controlled, showing just enough excitement to flatter Hepzibah's pride in ownership, while concealing the depths of his desperate hunger to possess them for his own purposes. The murder of Hepzibah Smith in 1961 was orchestrated with such subtle brilliance that even magical investigators found no evidence of foul play, attributing her death to the magical accident that Tom's careful preparation had made seem inevitable. The poison that killed her was administered through means so clever that it appeared to be the result of her own carelessness with dangerous magical substances, while the theft of her most precious possessions was disguised to look like the confused actions of a house elf who had been traumatized by her mistress's sudden death. Poor Hoki, the house elf who had served the Smith family faithfully for decades, was framed for both the murder and the theft, with evidence so carefully planted that even she believed herself guilty of the crimes. Her confusion and grief over Hepzibah's death made her an easy target for Tom's subtle mental manipulation as he implanted false memories and altered her recollections of the events surrounding her mistress's demise. The loyal creature's punishment and exile served Tom's purposes perfectly, removing the only witness who might have eventually remembered details that contradicted the official version of events. The acquisition of these two Founders' artifacts marked a turning point in Tom's transformation, as he now possessed enough magically powerful objects to begin the process of creating multiple Horcruxes. The knowledge he had gained from Professor Slughorn about the theoretical possibilities of splitting one's soul more than once became the foundation for experiments that would strip away the last vestiges of his humanity while granting him a form of immortality that came at the cost of everything that made existence worthwhile. His disappearance from the wizarding world following Hepzibah's murder was even more complete than his earlier vanishing act, as Tom Riddle, the charming young man, ceased to exist entirely, replaced by something darker and more terrible that would eventually emerge as Lord Voldemort. The decade from 1961 to 1971 represented the chrysalis stage of his transformation, a period of intensive magical experimentation and soul-splitting that would create the monster who would terrorize the wizarding world for decades to come. While Tom pursued his dark transformation in hidden places, far from civilized observation, the wizarding world he had temporarily abandoned was undergoing changes that would shape the political landscape he would eventually seek to dominate. The appointment of Nobby Leach as Minister for Magic in 1962 represented a seismic shift in the power structures that had governed magical Britain since its founding. As the first Muggle-born wizard to hold the highest office in the land, took control of institutions that had been designed by and for pure-blood families. Leach's appointment was both a symbol of progress and a catalyst for the kind of social upheaval that would eventually provide fertile ground for Voldemort's message of pure-blood supremacy and traditional values. The minister's policies aimed at reducing discrimination against Muggle-borns and half-bloods were met with fierce resistance from established families who saw their privileged position being eroded by governmental interference in what they considered to be natural social hierarchies. The reaction among the older pure-blood families was swift and often vicious, as decades of suppressed resentment at the changing nature of wizarding society found expression in both open protest and covert sabotage of the new minister's initiatives. Resignations from key ministry positions left important departments understaffed and ineffective, while those who remained often worked to undermine policies they disagreed with through deliberate incompetence or strategic delays in implementation. Abraxas Malfoy, father of Lucius and heir to one of the most influential pure-blood fortunes in Britain, emerged as one of the most vocal opponents of Leech's reforms, using his wealth and social connections to organize resistance among those who shared his views about the proper order of magical society. His drawing room became a gathering place for like-minded individuals who spoke in carefully coded language about the need to preserve traditional values and protect the wizarding world from corruption by inferior bloodlines. The mysterious illness that struck down Minister Leech in 1968 was attributed by many to the stress and overwork that came with trying to reform institutions that had resisted change for centuries. But whispered rumors suggested that his condition might have been induced through magical means by enemies who found his continued survival inconvenient to their own political ambitions. The fact that Abraxas Malfoy possessed both the means and motive to orchestrate such an attack was noted by those who paid attention to such things, though no evidence was ever found to support these suspicions. Leech's death, shortly after leaving office, created a power vacuum that was filled by individuals who were more sympathetic to traditional pure-blood interests, effectively reversing many of the reforms that had been implemented during his tenure. The message sent by this sequence of events was clear to anyone with eyes to see. Those who challenged the established order did so at their own peril, and even the highest office in the land could not protect someone who made too many enemies among the wrong people. The corruption and instability that followed Leech's demise weakened the ministry's ability to respond effectively to the various crises that would emerge during the coming decade, creating conditions that would prove ideal for someone with Voldemort's ambitions and abilities. A government that was divided against itself and uncertain of its own authority was ill-equipped to recognize or respond to threats that originated outside the normal political process. Into this world of political upheaval and social tension were born the children who would play crucial roles in the First Wizarding War, though their significance would not become apparent until many years later. Sirius Black, born in 1959, into one of the most prominent pure-blood families in Britain, entered a world where his very name carried expectations and obligations that would shape his entire life. The Black family's allegiance to traditional values and their contempt for those of inferior breeding were lessons taught from the cradle, though Sirius would eventually rebel against these teachings in ways that would shock and horrify his relatives. Peter Pettigrew's birth a few months after Sirius's represented the beginning of a life that would be defined by its ultimate betrayal of friendship and loyalty. Though the seeds of that betrayal lay decades in the future, his family's modest circumstances and unremarkable magical heritage made him an unlikely candidate for historical significance. Yet the choices he would make as an adult would directly contribute to some of the most pivotal events in wizarding history. The year 1960 brought the births of James Potter, Remus Lupin, Lily Evans, and Severus Snape, four individuals whose intertwined destinies would determine the ultimate outcome of Voldemort's war against the established order. James Potter's birth into a wealthy and well-respected pure-blood family provided him with advantages and opportunities that he would later use in service of causes that transcended personal ambition or family pride. Remus Lupin's early childhood was marked by the lycanthropic curse that would define his entire existence, transforming him into a creature that existed on the margins of magical society, while possessing a gentle nature that contradicted every stereotype about werewolves. His transformation at the age of 4 was the result of an attack by Fenrir Greyback, a savage werewolf whose alliance with dark forces represented the kind of recruitment that would later characterize Voldemort's approach to building his army. Lily Evans's birth into a Muggle family represented the kind of magical potential that pure-blood supremacists found most threatening, as her extraordinary abilities challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between magical power and bloodline purity. Her childhood in the Muggle world, growing up alongside her sister Petunia, who would never understand or accept the magical aspects of Lily's nature, provided her with perspectives that would prove invaluable in the battles to come. Severus Snape's birth into a household divided between magical and Muggle worlds created internal conflicts that would drive many of his future choices, as he struggled to reconcile his magical heritage with his father's contempt for anything connected to the wizarding world. His childhood friendship with Lily Evans represented one of the few bright spots in an otherwise difficult upbringing, marked by poverty, neglect, and the constant tension between his parents' incompatible worldviews. The decade of the 1960s, while Tom Riddle was transforming himself into Lord Voldemort through dark magic and soul-splitting rituals, was also a period of profound change in the broader magical world, as traditional institutions struggled to adapt to social pressures that had been building for generations. The International Confederation of Wizards was grappling with questions about magical integration with Muggle society that had no easy answers, while national magical governments tried to maintain the statute of secrecy. In an increasingly interconnected world where hiding magical activity was becoming more difficult, the rise of various magical rights movements during this period created both opportunities and challenges for those who would eventually oppose Voldemort's pure-blood supremacist ideology. House elf liberation advocates, werewolf rights campaigners, and supporters of magical creature equality were organizing with unprecedented effectiveness, though their efforts often met with violent opposition from traditionalists who viewed any challenge to established hierarchies as dangerous radicalism. These social tensions provided the perfect environment for the kind of divisive rhetoric that would later characterize Voldemort's recruitment strategy, as he would exploit fears about changing social orders to attract followers who felt threatened by the loss of their privileged status. The promise of a return to traditional values and clear social hierarchies would prove appealing to many who felt displaced by the rapid changes occurring in their world. Meanwhile, in the hidden places where Tom Riddle was conducting his transformation into Lord Voldemort, experiments in dark magic were reaching conclusions that would forever alter the balance of power in the wizarding world. The creation of multiple Horcruxes required not just the theoretical knowledge that Professor Slughorn had inadvertently provided, but practical experience in soul magic that pushed the boundaries of what any wizard had previously attempted. Each act of murder that enabled the creation of a new Horcrux stripped away another piece of Tom's humanity, while granting him incremental progress toward his goal of true immortality. The Ring of Marvolo Gaunt, his grandfather's heirloom containing the Resurrection Stone, became a repository for one fragment of his divided soul. The diary that had already housed his first Horcrux was joined by Ravenclaw's diadem, Hufflepuff's cup, and Slytherin's locket as vessels for the pieces of himself that he was systematically destroying and preserving. The physical transformation that accompanied this spiritual mutilation was gradual but inexorable. As Tom's once handsome features became gaunt and serpentine, his eyes taking on the red glow that would become his most distinctive characteristic. His voice, once charming and persuasive, acquired an otherworldly quality that spoke of power gained through methods that violated the fundamental laws of nature and morality. The magical abilities that resulted from these dark rituals exceeded anything that normal wizards could achieve through conventional means, granting him power over life and death that approached the capabilities attributed to the legendary founders of Hogwarts. His mastery of the dark arts became absolute, allowing him to create curses and hexes that had never existed before, and to command magical creatures that had previously been beyond the control of any single wizard. But perhaps the most significant development during this period was his recruitment of the beings and creatures that would form the core of his future army, as he sought out those who had been rejected or oppressed by mainstream wizarding society and offered them the chance for revenge against their perceived oppressors. Giants, werewolves, vampires, and other dark creatures were drawn to his banner by promises of equality and respect that masked his true intentions to use them as disposable tools in his quest for dominance. The transformation of the Knights of Walpurgis, his school-age followers, into the Death Eaters represented both continuity and evolution in his approach to building a power base. The young men who had followed him at Hogwarts out of admiration or fear were now adults with their own resources and connections, making them valuable allies in his larger campaign, while remaining personally devoted to the charismatic leader who had shaped their formative years. As 1971 approached, and Tom prepared to emerge from his decade of hidden preparation, the wizarding world he would re-enter was fundamentally different from the one he had left behind. The social and political upheavals of the intervening years had created exactly the kind of instability and division that would prove fertile ground for his message of pure blood supremacy and traditional values restored through force. The stage was set for the First Wizarding War, though few would recognize the opening moves when they began. The young people who would become heroes and villains in the coming conflict were beginning their education at Hogwarts, unaware that their childish conflicts and friendships would eventually determine the fate of the entire magical world. The Ministry officials who would have to respond to Voldemort's challenge were already weakened by internal divisions and corrupted by decades of political compromise. And somewhere in the shadows, the man who had once been Tom Riddle was making final preparations for his return to the world that had created him, armed with power beyond imagination and utterly freed from the moral constraints that limited other wizards. Lord Voldemort was ready to begin his campaign of terror and conquest, though the ultimate cost of victory would prove to be higher than even he could have anticipated. The year 1971 dawned with omens that only the most perceptive observers recognized as harbingers of the darkness to come. While the wizarding world celebrated what seemed to be an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity, shadows were already gathering in places where ancient magic still held sway and creatures of nightmare waited for someone powerful enough to command their allegiance. The man who had once been Tom Riddle was preparing to announce his return to a world that had forgotten the true meaning of fear, though his emergence would be gradual and calculated rather than the dramatic revelation that lesser dark wizards might have chosen. His first public action was both audacious and symbolic, a demonstration of contempt for the institutions that had shaped his youth, while simultaneously serving as a recruitment opportunity among those who shared his disdain for conventional authority. The letter that arrived at Hogwarts requesting an interview for the position of Defense Against the Dark Arts professor was written in elegant script that revealed nothing of its author's true nature, signed simply with the name Tom Marvolo Riddle, as if the previous decade of transformation had never occurred. Professor Dumbledore, now headmaster of Hogwarts and possessor of wisdom earned through decades of observing the patterns of power and corruption, recognized immediately that this request represented something far more significant than a simple employment application. The young man he had watched with growing concern during the 1940s had returned, though the nature of his transformation remained unclear. The decision to grant the interview despite his reservations would prove to be one of the most consequential meetings in the history of magical education. The conversation that took place in Dumbledore's office on that grey autumn morning was a masterpiece of subtle psychological warfare, each participant probing the other's defences while maintaining facades of civilized discourse. Tom appeared much changed from the handsome young man who had graduated from Hogwarts decades earlier, his features bearing the marks of magical experimentation that had pushed the boundaries of what the human form could endure while retaining functionality. Dumbledore's refusal to grant him the teaching position was delivered with the kind of diplomatic courtesy that masked absolute certainty about the correctness of the decision. He had seen enough of Tom's true nature during his school years to understand that placing him in a position of authority over young minds would be tantamount to delivering the next generation of magical Britain directly into the hands of someone who viewed other people as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be eliminated. The rejection was received with surface graciousness that concealed depths of rage and humiliation that would fuel Tom's hatred of both Dumbledore and Hogwarts for the remainder of his existence. The polite smile and understanding nod that he offered in response to being denied what he had come to see as his rightful due were performances worthy of the greatest actors, though Dumbledore's enhanced perception allowed him to see the malevolent fury that burned beneath the civilized exterior. The curse that Tom placed upon the defense against the dark arts position before leaving the castle was a masterwork of vindictive magic, designed to ensure that no one would successfully occupy the post that had been denied to him. The spell would claim professor after professor over the coming decades, creating a revolving door of instructors that would weaken Hogwarts' ability to prepare its students for the darkness that was already beginning to gather in the shadows of the wizarding world. His departure from Hogwarts marked the official beginning of what would later be known as the First Wizarding War, though the initial moves in this conflict were so subtle that most observers failed to recognize them as acts of aggression rather than random criminal activity. The recruitment campaign that Tom launched immediately after his rejection was conducted with the patience and strategic thinking of someone who understood that building a lasting power base required careful attention to both the quality and loyalty of one's followers. The pure-blood families who had been most vocal in their opposition to recent social reforms found themselves receiving visits from a charming and articulate young wizard who spoke eloquently about the need to preserve traditional values and protect magical society from the corrupting influences of Muggle-born integration. Tom's message resonated powerfully with those who felt that their privileged position was being eroded by governmental policies that favoured equality over hierarchy. Abraxas Malfoy, whose family had been instrumental in the downfall of Minister Leech, became one of Tom's most valuable early supporters, providing not just financial resources but access to social networks that included many of the most influential families in magical Britain. The drawing room gatherings that had previously focused on political resistance to reform legislation gradually evolved into strategy sessions for more direct action against what they perceived as threats to their way of life. The transformation of these respectable, pure-blood supremacists into active supporters of violent extremism was accomplished through a combination of ideological manipulation and practical demonstration of Tom's power. He showed them magic that exceeded anything they had thought possible, promised them a future where their superiority would be acknowledged and enforced, and gradually introduced them to concepts of racial purity and magical supremacy that went far beyond their previous political positions. The adoption of the name Lord Voldemort during this period represented both a psychological break with his past identity and a tactical decision about how he wanted to be perceived by both followers and enemies. Tom Riddle, the charming job applicant, ceased to exist, replaced by a figure whose very name carried connotations of power, mystery, and barely contained menace that would prove invaluable in the psychological warfare that was already beginning. The recruitment of dark creatures and marginalized magical beings proceeded simultaneously with his cultivation of pure-blood supremacist families. Though these two campaigns required entirely different approaches and promises, the giants who had been driven into hiding by centuries of persecution were offered the chance for revenge against the wizards who had decimated their numbers and stolen their ancestral lands. The werewolves who lived on the margins of magical society were promised acceptance and equality in a new world order where magical ability would matter more than the circumstances of one's condition. Fenrir Greyback, the savage werewolf whose attack had transformed young Remus Lupin, became one of Voldemort's most valuable lieutenants, not because of any ideological commitment, but because of his absolute ruthlessness and his ability to recruit others through the simple expedient of infecting them with lycanthropy. His pack of werewolves grew steadily throughout the early 1970s, creating a network of desperate individuals who had few options for survival other than service to the only wizard who offered them purpose and protection. The Dementors of Azkaban, creatures of such fundamental darkness that even their presence could drain hope and happiness from the strongest minds, were approached through intermediaries who understood the complex magical protocols required to communicate with beings whose very nature was antithetical to normal life. The partial alliance that Voldemort forged with these creatures would prove invaluable in the terror campaigns that would characterize the coming war, as their presence could paralyze entire communities with despair and hopelessness. The Acromantula colony deep in the Forbidden Forest, led by the ancient Aragog who had been Hagrid's pet during his student years, represented a different kind of recruitment challenge. These giant spiders had their own social hierarchy and territorial imperatives that were largely incompatible with human political structures, but they could be motivated by promises of expanded hunting grounds and reduced interference from wizards who viewed them as dangerous pests to be exterminated. The formation of this diverse army of outcasts, supremacists, and dark creatures required organizational skills that went far beyond Tom's previous experience with the relatively simple hierarchy of his school-age followers. Each group had different motivations, capabilities, and limitations that had to be taken into account when planning operations that would require coordination between allies who might otherwise be natural enemies. The infrastructure needed to support such a complex organization was established through a combination of legitimate business fronts and hidden strongholds that could serve as meeting places, training facilities, and secure storage for the magical weapons and artifacts that were being accumulated for future use. Ancient castles that had been abandoned for centuries were restored through dark magic and protected with wards that made them invisible to normal detection methods. The early attacks that marked the beginning of the war were carefully chosen to serve multiple strategic purposes while avoiding the kind of massive response that might have prompted immediate and overwhelming retaliation from Ministry forces. Isolated Muggle families were targeted not just for the terror value of their deaths, but because investigating such incidents required resources and expertise that local law enforcement agencies simply did not possess. The magical cleanup required after each attack consumed increasingly large amounts of Ministry time and manpower, as Obliviators worked to modify the memories of Muggle witnesses, while other specialists attempted to determine whether the deaths had been caused by magical means or were simply unusual coincidences. The deliberate use of methods that left ambiguous evidence forced Ministry investigators to spend weeks on cases that yielded little useful intelligence while consuming resources that might otherwise have been used more productively. Meanwhile, At Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, a new generation of students was beginning their magical education completely unaware that their childhood friendships and rivalries would eventually determine the outcome of the war that was already beginning around them. The Sorting Hat's placement of James Potter, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew in Gryffindor House created a friendship group whose loyalty and courage would be tested by challenges that none of them could have imagined during their first train ride to the castle. Severus Snape's assignment to Slytherin House placed him among students whose families were already being recruited into Voldemort's cause, creating social pressures and ideological influences that would shape his political development throughout his school years. The casual discussion of pure-blood supremacy and Muggle-born inferiority that characterized conversations in the Slytherin common room provided fertile ground for the kind of radicalization that Voldemort's agents were actively encouraging. Lily Evans' presence at Hogwarts as a Muggle-born witch of extraordinary ability represented everything that pure-blood supremacists found most threatening about the changing nature of magical society. Her friendship with Severus Snape created internal conflicts for the young wizard who was being pulled between his genuine affection for someone whose very existence contradicted the ideology he was being encouraged to embrace. The bullying incidents between James Potter and Severus Snape that would later become legendary among their classmates were symptomatic of larger tensions that existed throughout the school, as students from different backgrounds struggled to understand their place in a magical world that was becoming increasingly polarized. The casual cruelty that James and Sirius displayed towards Severus reflected attitudes that were common among pure-blood students who had been raised to view themselves as inherently superior to those of lesser breeding. Professor Dumbledore's growing awareness of the threat that Voldemort represented led to the implementation of security measures at Hogwarts that were subtle enough to avoid alarming students and parents, while providing genuine protection against the kind of infiltration and recruitment that was occurring throughout the rest of magical Britain. The appointment of additional defense against the dark arts professors, despite the curse on the position, reflected his understanding that the students would need practical knowledge of combat magic far sooner than anyone wanted to admit. The formation of the Order of the Phoenix during this period represented Dumbledore's recognition that the Ministry's response to the growing threat would be inadequate due to political constraints and institutional limitations that prevented rapid and decisive action. The secret organization was designed to operate outside official channels while maintaining enough coordination with legitimate authorities to avoid working at cross purposes with official investigations and responses. The recruitment of Order members required the same kind of careful evaluation that Voldemort was conducting with his own followers, as Dumbledore sought individuals whose magical abilities, moral character, and personal courage would allow them to function effectively in the kind of asymmetric warfare that was already beginning. Mad-Eye Moody's legendary paranoia and combat effectiveness made him an invaluable addition to the organization, though his methods sometimes conflicted with Dumbledore's preference for measured responses and minimal collateral damage. Frank and Alice Longbottom, both accomplished aurors whose professional experience had already exposed them to the darker aspects of magical law enforcement, brought crucial skills in investigation and combat magic that would prove essential as the conflict escalated. Their personal integrity and unwavering commitment to justice made them natural leaders within the Order's operational structure, though their prominence would eventually make them targets for Voldemort's most vicious followers. Hagrid's recruitment into the Order reflected Dumbledore's understanding that the half-giant's unique knowledge of magical creatures and his unshakable loyalty would be valuable assets in the coming struggle. His position as Keeper of Keys and Grounds at Hogwarts also provided the Order with an intelligence source within the school itself, allowing them to monitor potential threats to the students, while maintaining the appearance of normal educational operations. The Pruitt brothers, Fabian and Gideon, represented the kind of pure-blood wizards whose opposition to Voldemort's ideology demonstrated that blood status alone did not determine political allegiance. Their family's long tradition of service to the magical community and their personal courage made them natural choices for dangerous missions that required both magical skill and absolute discretion. Mrs. Fig's role as a squib living in the Muggle world provided the Order with capabilities that pure magical approaches could not duplicate, as her ability to move freely in both communities without attracting attention made her ideal for surveillance and communication tasks that would have been impossible for more obviously magical operatives. Her seemingly mundane existence concealed depths of dedication and courage that would prove invaluable throughout the coming conflict. Aberforth Dumbledore's participation in the Order was complicated by his relationship with his more famous brother and his own complicated history with authority figures, but his knowledge of Hogsmeade and his contacts among the more disreputable elements of magical society provided access to information and resources that more respectable sources could not supply. The Ministry's response to the growing crisis was hampered by the same political divisions and institutional weaknesses that had characterized magical government throughout the 1960s, as Minister Eugenia Jenkins struggled to balance public demands for action against the reality that her government lacked both the resources and the political unity necessary for an effective response to threats that operated outside traditional criminal categories. The Auror Department, which should have been the government's primary weapon against Voldemort's growing organization, was undermanned and poorly equipped to deal with enemies who used tactics and magic that went far beyond anything covered in standard law enforcement training. The authorization for Aurors to use unforgivable curses against Death Eaters would not come for several more years, leaving them at a severe disadvantage when facing opponents who acknowledged no moral or legal constraints on their methods. The public's initial response to reports of unusual deaths and disappearances was characterized more by curiosity than alarm, as most magical citizens found it difficult to believe that anyone would dare challenge the established order that had provided stability and prosperity for decades. The Ministry's careful control of information flow through the Daily Prophet and other media outlets helped maintain this complacency, though the strategy of downplaying the threat would eventually prove counterproductive when the true scope of the crisis became impossible to conceal. The international magical community's reaction to events in Britain was similarly restrained, as governments that had recently dealt with the aftermath of Grindelwald's War were reluctant to acknowledge that another dark wizard had emerged with potentially even greater ambitions and capabilities. The isolation that this created would prove costly, as Voldemort's influence began to spread beyond British borders and threaten the stability of magical communities throughout Europe. As 1973 approached, the various forces that would determine the war's outcome were beginning to take their final positions, though few participants understood the full scope of what they were preparing to face. The students at Hogwarts continued their education in an environment that remained outwardly peaceful, while Voldemort's agents worked to recruit the most promising candidates for future service. The Ministry struggled to maintain order and public confidence while facing threats that exceeded their institutional capacity to comprehend or combat effectively. And in the hidden places where Voldemort was marshalling his forces for the campaign of terror and conquest that would define the next decade, final preparations were being made for a war that would test every assumption about the nature of good and evil, the price of freedom, and the ultimate limits of magical power wielded without moral constraint. The First Wizarding War was about to begin in earnest, though its true horror would not become apparent until the blood had begun to flow and the darkness had spread far beyond anyone's ability to contain or control. The transformation of what had begun as isolated incidents of magical violence into a full-scale war occurred with the inexorable progression of a disease spreading through a weakened population, each new outbreak more severe than the last, until the infection threatened to consume the entire body of wizarding society. By 1973, Lord Voldemort's name was whispered in drawing rooms and ministry corridors with the kind of fearful respect that had once been reserved for natural disasters or divine punishment, as reports of atrocities committed by his followers reached every corner of magical Britain. Minister Harold Mincham, who had replaced the ineffective Eugenia Jenkins in 1975, after public confidence in the government's ability to maintain order had collapsed entirely, brought to his office a military background and an aggressive approach to combating threats that exceeded anything his predecessors had been willing to contemplate. His authorization of increasingly harsh measures against suspected Death Eaters represented both a necessary escalation in response to genuine threats and a dangerous precedent that would have lasting implications for the nature of magical law enforcement. The unforgivable curses, which had been prohibited for use by ministry personnel since their classification decades earlier, were quietly authorized for deployment against Death Eaters under circumstances that were defined so broadly that individual Aurors were left to make life and death decisions based on their own judgment rather than clear legal guidelines. This policy change, while tactically necessary given the enemy's complete willingness to use any weapon available, created moral complications that would haunt many of those charged with its implementation. Alastor Moody's legendary career during this period was built upon a foundation of tactical brilliance and personal courage that exceeded anything in Auror Department records, but it was also marked by a gradual erosion of the idealistic principles that had originally motivated his decision to enter law enforcement. Each encounter with Death Eaters required methods that pushed the boundaries of what civilized society should ask of its defenders, while each victory came at personal costs that accumulated like compound interest on a debt that could never be fully repaid. His first authorized use of the Cruciatus Curse came during a raid on a Death Eater safe house where captured Order members were being tortured for information about Dumbledore's organization and operational methods. The decision to inflict the same suffering on their tormentors that they had been visiting upon innocent prisoners was both strategically sound and morally devastating, representing a line crossed that could never be uncrossed, regardless of the justification that circumstances provided. The intelligence gathered through these harsh interrogation methods proved invaluable in disrupting Death Eater operations and preventing attacks that would have cost dozens of innocent lives, but the psychological toll on the Aurors who conducted such sessions was evident to anyone who worked closely with them. Mad Eye's increasing paranoia and isolation during this period reflected not just reasonable caution in the face of genuine threats, but the internal damage caused by regularly employing methods that violated every principle of justice and human dignity that had originally attracted him to his chosen profession. The expansion of Death Eater targets from isolated Muggle families to include Muggle-born wizards and blood traitors represented a significant escalation in both the scope and intensity of the conflict, as Voldemort's followers demonstrated their willingness to attack members of their own community who failed to meet their standards of racial purity and ideological conformity. The psychological impact of these attacks extended far beyond their immediate victims, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that affected every aspect of daily life in magical Britain. The dark mark that appeared over the homes of murder victims became the most potent symbol of terror that the wizarding world had known since the medieval witch hunts. Its green skull and serpent, visible for miles, as a declaration that nowhere was safe from Voldemort's reach. Families would return from routine shopping trips to find this ominous sign floating above their dwellings, knowing that they would discover the bodies of their loved ones inside while their neighbors watched from safe distances, too terrified to offer assistance or comfort. The systematic use of the Imperious Curse to create unwilling agents within magical society represented perhaps the most insidious aspect of Voldemort's campaign, as the spell's ability to override free will while leaving its victims apparently unchanged made it impossible to distinguish between genuine supporters and those who had been magically compelled to serve his cause. The paranoia that this tactic created within the magical community was almost as effective as actual violence in disrupting social cohesion and undermining trust in established institutions. Families began to suspect their own members of treachery when loved ones displayed unusual behavior or expressed opinions that seemed inconsistent with their previously stated beliefs. The Ministry's attempts to develop reliable tests for Imperious Curse influence proved inadequate against Voldemort's sophisticated understanding of mind magic, leaving investigators to rely on intuition and circumstantial evidence when making determinations that could mean the difference between life and death for those under suspicion. The Order of the Phoenix's response to these escalating threats required adaptations that pushed the secret organization far beyond its original mandate of intelligence gathering and protective activities. The need to conduct offensive operations against Death Eater strongholds and supply networks demanded capabilities that few of Dumbledore's original recruits possessed, forcing the rapid recruitment and training of individuals whose combat experience and moral flexibility made them suitable for increasingly dangerous assignments. The death of Fabian and Gideon Pruitt during a mission to capture a group of Death Eaters who had been conducting experiments on Muggle prisoners marked a turning point in the Order's operational philosophy, as their loss demonstrated that even the most skilled and experienced operatives could be overwhelmed by enemies who possessed superior numbers and complete willingness to fight to the death rather than accept capture. The 5 Death Eaters who killed the Pruitt brothers died in the same battle, but their sacrifice yielded none of the intelligence benefits that might have justified the tactical risks involved. The psychological impact of losing 2 of their most respected members reverberated throughout the Order's membership, forcing a recognition that their struggle against Voldemort's forces was not a temporary emergency that could be resolved through limited commitment and careful planning. This was total war against an enemy who would accept nothing less than complete victory or absolute destruction, requiring a level of dedication and sacrifice that many had not anticipated when they first joined Dumbledore's cause. Molly Weasley's grief over the loss of her brothers became a driving force behind the Order's increasingly aggressive response to Death Eater activities, as her demands for retribution reflected the feelings of many members who had watched friends and family members fall victim to an enemy that showed no mercy to the wounded or captured. Her transformation from supportive family member to active participant in combat operations exemplified the war's ability to reshape even the most peaceful individuals into instruments of necessary violence. The authorization granted to Aurors and Order members to use killing curses against Death Eaters represented the final abandonment of peacetime legal and moral constraints in favor of wartime pragmatism that prioritized results over principles. Barty Crouch Senior's argument that fighting monsters required monstrous methods resonated with public opinion that had been shaped by months of reports about atrocities committed against innocent civilians who had done nothing to deserve their fate, except exist in a world that Voldemort sought to remake according to his twisted vision. Mad-Eye Moody's legendary reputation was built during this period of authorized brutality, as his tactical innovations and personal courage made him the most effective Death Eater hunter in the Ministry's employ, while his increasing paranoia and isolation reflected the psychological costs of such effectiveness. His development of enhanced detection methods and defensive devices was driven by hard-won understanding that survival in this conflict required constant vigilance and preparation for threats that conventional thinking would dismiss as impossible or unlikely. The magical eye that would become his most famous prosthetic was acquired after a particularly vicious encounter with a group of Death Eaters who had been using Polyjuice Potion to impersonate ministry officials, allowing them to move freely through government buildings while gathering intelligence about aura operations and order activities. The loss of his natural eye was the price of detecting their deception before it could be used to devastating effect, though the enhanced vision provided by its magical replacement would prove invaluable in subsequent operations. His wooden leg, earned during a raid on a Death Eater stronghold that had been booby-trapped with curses designed to kill or maim anyone who breached its defenses, became another symbol of his dedication to the war effort, while serving as a constant reminder of the prices that such dedication demanded. The prosthetic limb was enhanced with detection spells and defensive enchantments that made it superior to natural flesh in some ways, though it also marked him as a target for enemies who recognized his distinctive appearance and understood his importance to the government's counter-terrorism efforts. The scars that accumulated across Mad Eye's body during his years of active service told the story of the war's escalation in ways that official reports could never convey, each mark representing an encounter with enemies who possessed both the skill and determination to inflict serious damage on one of the ministry's most capable operatives. The missing portion of his nose, carved away by a curse that had been designed to cause disfiguring injuries rather than quick death, reflected the Death Eater's preference for inflicting suffering over achieving tactical objectives through efficient means. The psychological transformation that accompanied his physical injuries was equally dramatic, as the idealistic young Auror, who had entered the conflict with clear moral principles, evolved into someone whose methods were dictated entirely by practical considerations of effectiveness and survival. His increasing reliance on detection devices and paranoid security measures reflected not just reasonable caution, but a fundamental understanding that the enemy he faced was willing to use any weapon or tactic that might provide advantage, regardless of its impact on innocent bystanders or social conventions. The campaign against the giants who had allied with Voldemort demonstrated both the ministry's growing willingness to use extreme measures and the tactical challenges involved in combating non-human allies whose motivations and capabilities differed significantly from those of wizard Death Eaters. The systematic extermination of giant tribes that had been recruited through promises of territory and revenge required resources and moral compromises that strained the magical government's capacity, while achieving results that were strategically necessary but ethically questionable. Mad Eye's personal involvement in these operations, which required the use of killing curses against sentient beings whose primary crime was alliance with the wrong side in a conflict they barely understood, added another layer of moral complexity to his already complicated relationship with violence as a tool of policy. The giant's primitive social structure and limited understanding of wizard politics made them easy targets for Voldemort's recruitment efforts, while also making them tragic victims of a war that they had not chosen and could not fully comprehend. The forced retreat of surviving giants to remote mountain regions, where they could pose no immediate threat to civilian populations, represented a strategic victory that came at enormous cost in resources and personnel, while also creating long-term problems that would persist long after the immediate crisis had passed. The survivors' resentment and desire for revenge would provide fertile ground for future recruitment by dark wizards who understood how to exploit grievances that had been created by the very methods used to achieve short-term security goals. The capture of Igor Karkaroff, which became one of Mad Eye's most celebrated achievements during this period, required months of patient investigation and dangerous undercover work that demonstrated both his tactical brilliance and his willingness to accept personal risks that exceeded anything that reasonable duty might require. Karkaroff's knowledge of Death Eater organizational structure and operational methods made him a high-value target whose capture could provide intelligence benefits that justified extraordinary efforts and resources. The investigation that led to Karkaroff's location revealed the sophisticated support networks that Voldemort had established throughout Europe, as Death Eater operatives used legitimate business fronts and social connections to create safe houses and supply lines that extended far beyond British borders. The international scope of these operations demonstrated that the conflict was not merely a domestic crisis, but part of a larger campaign that threatened magical communities throughout the civilized world. Mad Eye's infiltration of these networks required the kind of deep cover work that pushed the boundaries of what individual operatives could endure, while maintaining their psychological stability and moral clarity. The need to establish genuine relationships with criminals and terrorists, while concealing his true identity and mission, created internal conflicts that were resolved only through the kind of mental compartmentalization that would have lasting effects on his personality and worldview. The actual capture of Karkaroff was accomplished through a combination of tactical deception and overwhelming force that left no room for escape or resistance. Though the Death Eater's attempts to negotiate his surrender, in exchange for information about his former associates, revealed the kind of loyalty that Voldemort inspired among his followers. The intelligence gathered through Karkaroff's eventual cooperation provided crucial insights into Death Eater recruitment methods and organizational structure, though it also demonstrated the fragility of allegiances that were based on fear rather than genuine commitment. The broader campaign against Death Eater operations during this period was characterized by a series of tactical victories that failed to achieve decisive strategic results, as Voldemort's organization proved remarkably resilient in the face of even severe losses. The capture or killing of individual Death Eaters, while valuable for preventing specific attacks and gathering intelligence, did little to degrade the organization's overall capability, as long as its leadership remained intact and its recruitment efforts continued to attract new followers. The Ministry's statistical reports during this period painted a picture of steady progress in the war against Voldemort's forces, with graphs and charts documenting the number of Death Eaters captured, the quantity of dark artifacts seized, and the number of attacks prevented through proactive intelligence work. But these metrics failed to capture the reality that the enemy was adapting faster than the government forces, developing new tactics and recruitment methods that offset their losses while maintaining offensive capabilities that kept magical Britain in a constant state of emergency. The psychological warfare aspects of the conflict proved particularly challenging for conventional law enforcement approaches, as Voldemort's use of terror tactics was designed not just to achieve specific military objectives, but to undermine public confidence in the government's ability to provide basic security. The dark mark floating over murder scenes was as much a political statement as a practical communication method, broadcasting the message that nowhere was safe from his reach, while advertising his organization's power to anyone who might be considering joining his cause. The Ministry's response to these psychological challenges was hampered by the same institutional limitations that affected their military operations, as officials who were trained to maintain order through established legal procedures found themselves dealing with enemies who operated outside all conventional frameworks of criminal behavior. The need to maintain public morale while acknowledging the reality of the threats they faced created communication challenges that were never satisfactorily resolved throughout the conflict's duration. The impact of the war on magical society extended far beyond the direct casualties and property damage that were recorded in official reports, as the constant threat of violence and the pervasive atmosphere of suspicion and fear fundamentally altered the social fabric that had provided stability and community for centuries. Families that had lived peacefully alongside their neighbors for generations found themselves questioning the loyalty and intentions of people they had known all their lives. While traditional gathering places and social events were abandoned due to security concerns that made normal interaction impossible, the economic consequences of the conflict were equally severe, as businesses that depended on public confidence and social stability found their customer base eroding, while the costs of enhanced security measures consumed resources that might otherwise have been invested in growth and improvement. The magical transportation networks that connected wizarding communities throughout Britain were repeatedly targeted by Death Eater attacks, creating disruptions that affected everything from mail delivery to emergency medical services. The education system, which should have provided continuity and normalcy for children whose lives were being disrupted by forces beyond their comprehension, became another battlefield, as families struggled to balance their desire to provide their offspring with proper magical training against concerns about exposing them to recruitment efforts by both sides in the conflict. Hogwarts, despite Dumbledore's best efforts to maintain its traditional role as a sanctuary of learning, could not entirely escape the pressures that were reshaping every other aspect of magical society. The international ramifications of the First Wizarding War were felt throughout the magical world, as governments that had hoped to remain neutral in what they initially viewed as a British domestic crisis found themselves dealing with refugees, intelligence sharing requests, and diplomatic pressures that forced them to take sides in a conflict they had not chosen. The failure of international magical institutions to provide effective support for counter-terrorism efforts reflected both the limitations of existing cooperation mechanisms and the reluctance of sovereign magical governments to compromise their independence for collective security benefits. As 1978 approached and the conflict entered its most intense phase, all participants understood that the struggle had evolved far beyond its original parameters to become a fundamental contest over the future direction of magical civilization. The outcome would determine not just who held political power in Britain, but what kinds of values and institutions would guide magical society for generations to come, making compromise or negotiated settlement impossible for either side. The stage was set for the personal tragedies and ultimate resolution that would define the war's final phase, as individual choices made by people whose names would echo through history began to interact in ways that none of them could have anticipated when they first took sides in what had seemed like a straightforward conflict between good and evil. The complexity that had emerged from these simple beginnings would require sacrifices that no one should have been asked to make, though the alternative of surrender to Voldemort's vision was too horrible to contemplate for anyone who retained any vestige of moral clarity or human compassion. The year 1978 marked the end of childhood innocence for a generation of young witches and wizards who had grown up believing that the magical world was a place of wonder and possibility, only to discover that it could also be a realm of unimaginable cruelty and systematic evil. The graduation ceremony at Hogwarts that summer was conducted under security measures that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier, as families gathered to celebrate their children's achievements while knowing that many of these bright young faces would soon disappear into a war that had already claimed too many promising lives. Severus Snape's journey toward the Death Eaters had been years in the making, shaped by a combination of personal grievances, ideological indoctrination, and the kind of social pressures that transformed individual resentment into collective hatred with devastating efficiency. His childhood friendship with Lily Evans, which had once represented the possibility of bridging the divide between magical and muggle worlds, had deteriorated under the weight of circumstances that neither of them fully understood until it was too late to repair the damage. The incident by the lake during their 5th year, when James Potter and Sirius Black had humiliated him in front of half the school by hanging him upside down and exposing his undergarments to the jeering crowd, had been the culmination of years of systematic bullying that had driven him to seek protection and validation among those who promised him power and respect. The word that had escaped his lips in that moment of rage and humiliation, Mudblood, had not just ended his friendship with Lily, but marked the point of no return in his slide toward embracing the very ideology that would have seen her destroyed. Lily's shock and hurt at hearing that term applied to her by someone she had considered a dear friend revealed the depth of the divisions that were tearing apart their generation, as pure blood supremacist rhetoric that had once been confined to the margins of magical society became increasingly mainstream among students who had been raised to view themselves as inherently superior to those of lesser breeding. Her attempts to maintain their friendship despite the growing evidence of his political radicalization had been motivated by genuine affection and hope for redemption, but they had also demonstrated the kind of naive optimism that the war would soon strip away from everyone who wished to survive it. The Slytherin common room during Severus's final years at Hogwarts had become a recruiting ground for Voldemort's cause, as older students who had already committed themselves to the Death Eater ideology worked to indoctrinate younger members of their house through a combination of peer pressure and ideological instruction. The conversations that took place in those dark chambers beneath the lake were filled with discussions of blood, purity, and magical supremacy that were presented as simple statements of biological fact rather than the poisonous propaganda they actually represented. Avery, Mulciber, and other members of Severus's year who came from families with established Death Eater connections served as conduits for recruitment efforts that were coordinated by adults who understood how to exploit the insecurities and ambitions of adolescents whose identities were still forming. The promise of belonging to an elite organization that valued their magical heritage and offered them purposes larger than individual achievement proved irresistibly attractive to young people who had been raised to believe in their own superiority, but had not yet found appropriate outlets for such beliefs. The defense against the dark arts instruction they received, while officially neutral in its presentation, inevitably exposed students to magical techniques and theoretical frameworks that could be easily adapted for offensive purposes by those who possessed the inclination and opportunity to do so. Severus's natural talent for potion making and his innovative approach to spell creation made him particularly valuable to those who recognized his potential contributions to their cause, while his personal grievances against James Potter and his friends provided additional motivation for embracing an ideology that promised revenge against those who had wronged him. The transformation of James Potter from an arrogant bully into someone worthy of Lily Evans's affection was one of the few bright spots in a period that was otherwise marked by the systematic corruption of everything decent and hopeful in their generation. His recognition that his previous behavior had been not just cruel but fundamentally wrong required a kind of moral courage that many of his peers never developed, as it demanded acknowledgement of personal failures and commitment to change that was difficult to sustain without external validation or immediate rewards. The maturation process that allowed James to win Lily's respect and eventually her love was accelerated by the realities of the war that was consuming their world, as the luxury of adolescent selfishness became impossible to maintain when faced with genuine threats to everything they valued. His decision to join the Order of the Phoenix immediately upon graduation reflected not just personal courage, but understanding that neutrality was not an option when faced with enemies who would interpret inaction as complicity with their agenda. Sirius Black's rebellion against his family's traditional values had begun long before his final year at Hogwarts, but his complete break with the House of Black was formalized during this period, as he chose loyalty to his friends over the considerable advantages that conformity with pure blood expectations might have provided. His disinheritance and removal from the family tapestry was both a personal tragedy and a political statement, demonstrating that blood relationships were not sufficient to override moral convictions when the stakes involved fundamental questions of right and wrong. Remus Lupin's lycanthropy, which had been a closely guarded secret throughout his school years, became both a vulnerability and a source of valuable intelligence as the war escalated, and Voldemort's recruitment of werewolves provided the Order with opportunities to gather information about enemy activities. His unique position as someone who could move within werewolf communities while maintaining his loyalty to Dumbledore's cause made him an invaluable asset, though it also exposed him to dangers that went far beyond the physical risks of his monthly transformations. Peter Pettigrew's gradual drift toward treachery was so subtle that even his closest friends failed to recognize the warning signs, until it was far too late to prevent the catastrophe that would result from his betrayal. His feelings of inadequacy within a group that included such remarkable individuals as James, Sirius, and Remus created psychological vulnerabilities that Voldemort's agents were trained to identify and exploit, though the process of turning him into an active collaborator required years of careful manipulation and progressive compromises that eroded his moral foundations, one small step at a time. The marriages that took place during this period represented both personal happiness and strategic alliances in a conflict where every relationship had political implications that extended far beyond the individuals involved. James and Lily's wedding, conducted under security measures that turned what should have been a celebration into something approaching a military operation, symbolized the determination of their generation to maintain hope and build futures even in the face of seemingly overwhelming darkness. Alice and Frank Longbottom's union brought together two of the most capable Aurors of their generation, creating a partnership that would prove invaluable in the fight against Voldemort's forces, while also establishing a family that would become a primary target for Death Eater revenge once the full scope of their contributions to the war effort became apparent. Their professional competence and personal integrity made them natural leaders within both the Ministry's official response and Dumbledore's covert operations, though these same qualities would eventually mark them for destruction by enemies who could not tolerate effective opposition to their agenda. The Order of the Phoenix's operational tempo during this period reflected the desperate nature of their situation, as reports of Death Eater activities required responses that pushed the organization's capabilities to their absolute limits while demanding sacrifices that no one should have been asked to make. The 20-to-1 odds that they faced in terms of active combatants made every mission a calculated risk that could result in catastrophic losses if plans went wrong or intelligence proved inaccurate. Dumbledore's strategic leadership during this phase of the conflict demonstrated both his tactical brilliance and the moral complexity of commanding an organization that was forced to operate outside legal constraints while maintaining some semblance of ethical standards. His decisions about which operations to approve and which risks were acceptable required judgments that balanced immediate tactical advantages against long-term consequences that could affect the entire future of magical civilization. The intelligence networks that provided information about Death Eater activities were built through relationships that had been developed over decades of careful cultivation, as former students, colleagues, and allies provided access to information that could not be obtained through official channels. The risks that these sources accepted in order to support the Order's mission represented heroism of the highest order, as exposure would have meant not just death but torture and the systematic elimination of everyone they cared about. The safe houses that provided refuge for those fleeing Death Eater persecution were established and maintained through resources that came from sympathetic families who understood that their wealth and influence carried obligations to those who lacked such advantages. The Fidelius charm and other advanced protective magic that secured these locations required magical expertise that was available to only a small number of practitioners, making the Order's network of refuges both invaluable and desperately vulnerable to betrayal or discovery. The propaganda war that accompanied the physical conflict was waged through methods that ranged from subtle influence operations to direct confrontation with Death Eater recruitment efforts in communities throughout magical Britain. The contest for public opinion required resources and expertise that the Order possessed in limited quantities. While Voldemort's message of pure blood supremacy and traditional values resonated with segments of the magical population who felt threatened by social changes that they could not understand or control, the psychological toll on Order members, who were forced to maintain normal lives while participating in activities that violated every principle of civilized behavior, was evident in the increasing isolation and paranoia that characterized their interactions with family and friends who were not part of the organization. The compartmentalization required to function effectively in such circumstances created internal divisions that would persist long after the immediate crisis had passed, leaving scars that could never be entirely healed, regardless of the war's ultimate outcome. The prophecy that would eventually determine the conflict's resolution was delivered during this period, though its full significance was not immediately apparent to those who heard portions of it without understanding the complete context. Sybil Trelawney's genuine moment of prophetic insight, which occurred during her job interview with Dumbledore, represented the kind of magical phenomenon that academic study could describe but never fully explain, as true prophecy operated through channels that existed beyond normal understanding of cause and effect. The partial overhearing of this prophecy by Severus Snape, who had been eavesdropping outside the Three Broomsticks in hopes of gathering intelligence that might prove valuable to his Death Eater associates, set in motion the chain of events that would ultimately lead to Voldemort's downfall, though the irony of this outcome would not become apparent for many years. His decision to report what he had heard to his master demonstrated both his loyalty to the Death Eater cause and his failure to understand the implications of the information he was providing. Voldemort's interpretation of the prophetic fragment that Severus brought to him revealed both his strategic thinking and the limitations of his understanding when confronted with magic that operated outside the normal frameworks of power and control that defined his worldview. His focus on the threat represented by a child who would be born with the power to defeat him led to tactical decisions that would ultimately ensure the prophecy's fulfillment, though his belief in his own analytical capabilities prevented him from considering such possibilities. The identification of Harry Potter and Neville Longbottom as the potential subjects of the prophecy created a crisis that tested every assumption about fate, choice, and the nature of prophetic magic that had guided wizarding understanding for centuries. Dumbledore's decision to share this information with the families involved represented a calculated risk that acknowledged both their right to know and their need to prepare for dangers that exceeded anything they had previously faced. Severus's realization that his actions had marked Lily Evans Potter for death created the psychological crisis that would transform him from loyal Death Eater into double agent working for Dumbledore's cause, though the process of this conversion would require confronting moral failures and personal inadequacies that he had spent years avoiding. His love for Lily, which had persisted despite their estrangement, and her marriage to his former tormentor, provided the emotional foundation for choices that would ultimately prove crucial to Voldemort's defeat. The meeting between Severus and Dumbledore that formalized his change of allegiance took place under circumstances that emphasized the desperate nature of their situation and the limited options available to all participants in the conflict. Dumbledore's willingness to trust someone whose loyalty had been demonstrated to the enemy rather than to his cause reflected both his understanding of human nature and his recognition that victory would require allies from unexpected sources. The protection arrangements made for the Potter and Longbottom families represented the most sophisticated defensive magic that the Order could provide, utilizing techniques that had been refined through years of protecting high-value targets from enemies who possessed both the motivation and capability to overcome conventional security measures. The Fidelius charm, which could make locations completely undetectable to anyone not specifically told of their existence by designated secret keepers, offered the kind of absolute protection that no other magic could match. The psychological pressure experienced by families who were forced to live under such restrictions was enormous, as the isolation required for complete security meant severing contact with friends and extended family members who could not be trusted with information that would make them targets for Death Eater revenge. The decision to trust one's life and the lives of loved ones to a single individual chosen as secret keeper represented an act of faith that could not be based on certainty, but only on hope and careful evaluation of character. James and Lily's decision to make Sirius Black their secret keeper was based on years of friendship and shared danger that had tested his loyalty under circumstances that revealed the true nature of his character. Their subsequent choice to switch to Peter Pettigrew, without informing anyone else of this change, reflected tactical thinking about operational security that proved to be both logical and catastrophically wrong, as they correctly identified the need for misdirection while failing to recognize the true source of the threat they faced. The period of hiding that followed the implementation of these security measures was characterized by a tension that affected every aspect of daily life, as the knowledge that discovery would mean certain death for everyone involved created psychological pressures that tested the strongest relationships. The enforced inactivity was particularly difficult for individuals who had spent years in active combat against Voldemort's forces, as the transition from aggressive engagement to passive defense required psychological adjustments that were not easily made. The birth of Harry Potter in July of 1980 represented both personal joy and strategic complication, as the existence of a child who might be the subject of the prophecy created additional security challenges, while providing emotional fulfillment that made the sacrifices required for protection seem worthwhile. The knowledge that their son might be destined to face dangers that no child should have to confront added layers of complexity to parental decisions that were already complicated by wartime security requirements. Neville Longbottom's birth a day before Harry's created the ambiguity that would ultimately determine which family would become Voldemort's primary target. Though both sets of parents understood that their children's safety depended on factors that were largely beyond their control, the statistical probability that their sons would survive to adulthood was grim under the best of circumstances, while the prophecy's implications suggested that survival might require capabilities and choices that no parent would want to contemplate for their offspring. The intelligence networks that monitored Death Eater activities during this period provided warnings about increased surveillance and reconnaissance efforts that suggested major operations were being planned, though the specific targets and timing remained unclear, despite the best efforts of Order operatives who risked their lives to gather such information. The patterns of activity that emerged from analysis of these reports indicated a level of coordination and planning that exceeded anything Voldemort's organization had previously demonstrated. The final months before Voldemort's attack on the Potter family were marked by a crescendo of violence and terror that pushed magical Britain to the breaking point, as Death Eater operations reached a frequency and intensity that overwhelmed the Ministry's capacity to respond effectively, while demonstrating the inadequacy of conventional law enforcement approaches when facing enemies who acknowledged no constraints on their methods. The social fabric that had held wizarding society together for centuries was stretched to its limits by forces that seemed determined to destroy everything that previous generations had built. The personal relationships that had sustained Order members through years of struggle began to show signs of strain under pressures that tested every assumption about loyalty, trust, and the prices that should be acceptable in pursuit of victory over evil. The knowledge that anyone could be an enemy, either through voluntary choice or magical compulsion, created psychological burdens that affected every interaction while making normal human connection increasingly difficult to maintain. The strategic situation as October 1981 approached reflected a conflict that had reached a kind of equilibrium based on mutual exhaustion rather than decisive advantage for either side, as both the Order and the Death Eaters had sustained losses that weakened their operational capabilities while failing to achieve the kind of breakthrough that might have determined the war's ultimate outcome. The stalemate could not continue indefinitely, as the social and political costs of prolonged conflict were undermining the foundations of magical civilization itself. The prophecy that had been made years earlier hung over all participants like a sword that would eventually fall, though none could predict exactly when or how its terms would be fulfilled. The children who had been born under its shadow were approaching the age when their destinies would be determined by choices made by adults who understood the stakes involved, but lacked the wisdom to predict the consequences of their actions. The stage was set for the final act of a tragedy that had been years in the making, though the ultimate resolution would come through means that none of the principal actors had anticipated. The betrayal that would echo through wizarding history began not with dramatic confrontation or sudden revelation, but with the quiet desperation of a man who had spent years living beyond his courage while pretending to possess bravery he had never actually felt. Peter Pettigrew's transformation from loyal friend to willing traitor was a gradual corruption that had been years in the making, nurtured by feelings of inadequacy and fear that had festered in the shadow of companions whose natural heroism made his own weaknesses seem all the more glaring and shameful. The moment when Peter first made contact with Voldemort's agents came not through ideological conviction or sudden revelation about the righteousness of their cause, but through the simple terror of someone who understood that he was ill-equipped to survive a war that demanded more courage than he possessed. His overtures to the Death Eaters were initially motivated by nothing more noble than self-preservation, a desperate attempt to ensure his own survival in a conflict where neutrality was impossible, and choosing the wrong side meant certain death. The recruitment process that transformed Peter from reluctant contact to active collaborator demonstrated Voldemort's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and his ability to exploit the specific vulnerabilities that made individuals susceptible to corruption. Rather than demanding immediate and dramatic betrayals that might have shocked Peter into resistance, his handlers began with small compromises and minor acts of disloyalty that established patterns of cooperation, while gradually eroding the moral barriers that might have prevented more serious treachery. The intelligence that Peter provided during his months as a double agent was carefully selected to avoid immediate suspicion, while still offering sufficient value to maintain his credibility with his Death Eater contacts. Information about order operations was filtered through layers of misdirection and partial truth that made his reports useful without being obviously comprehensive, allowing him to serve both masters while hoping that the conflict would somehow resolve itself without requiring him to make choices that would forever mark him as a traitor to his friends. The psychological toll of living with such deception was evident to anyone who knew Peter well, though his friends attributed his increasing nervousness and erratic behavior to the general stress that affected everyone involved in the war, rather than recognizing it as evidence of the specific guilt that comes from betraying those who trust you completely. His ability to maintain the appearance of loyalty while systematically undermining the cause he pretended to serve required a kind of mental compartmentalization that gradually destroyed his capacity for genuine human connection. The decision to make Peter the secret keeper for the Potter family represented both tactical brilliance and catastrophic misjudgment, as James and Lily correctly identified the need for operational security while failing to understand that their greatest enemy was already within their circle of trust. The switch from Sirius Black, who would have died rather than reveal their location, to Peter Pettigrew, who had already compromised his loyalty beyond redemption, was based on sound strategic thinking that was undermined by incomplete knowledge of the true threat they faced. The weeks that followed Peter's appointment as secret keeper were marked by an escalation in his communications with Voldemort's organization, as he provided detailed information about the protective measures that had been implemented around Godric's Hollow, while receiving instructions about how to facilitate the attack that would eliminate the Potter family and secure the Potter family. Prophesied child who threatened his master's plans for immortal dominion over the wizarding world. The moral anguish that Peter experienced during this period was genuine but insufficient to overcome his fundamental cowardice and self-interest, as he convinced himself that the Potter family's fate was already sealed, regardless of his actions, and that his cooperation might at least ensure his own survival in a world where Voldemort's victory seemed increasingly inevitable. These rationalizations allowed him to function while planning the destruction of people who had shown him nothing but friendship and trust throughout their years together. Voldemort's decision to personally conduct the attack on Godric's Hollow reflected both his understanding of the prophecy's implications and his desire to eliminate what he perceived as the greatest threat to his continued existence. The fact that a child barely a year old could represent such danger to the most powerful dark wizard in history might have given pause to someone possessed of greater wisdom or humility, but Voldemort's arrogance and fear combined to make the mission seem not just necessary but urgent. The preparations for the attack were conducted with the same meticulous planning that characterized all of Voldemort's major operations, as every possible contingency was considered, and countermeasures were developed to deal with whatever defenses the Order might have established around their most precious assets. The intelligence provided by Peter about the specific protective spells and monitoring systems that had been implemented allowed for tactical approaches that could bypass or neutralize most conventional security measures. The night of October 31st, 1981, began like any other evening in the hidden cottage at Godric's Hollow, where James and Lily Potter were attempting to maintain some semblance of normal family life despite the extraordinary circumstances that had made such normalcy impossible for anyone else in their situation. The domestic routines of feeding their infant son and preparing for bedtime provided psychological comfort that helped them cope with the knowledge that enemies were constantly seeking ways to discover and destroy their carefully protected sanctuary. Harry Potter's behavior that evening was unremarkable for a child of his age, showing no signs of the prophetic destiny that would soon transform him into the most famous wizard in the modern world. while simultaneously making him an orphan whose childhood would be shaped by forces he could not understand or control. His parents' love and attention provided the foundation for magical protections that would prove more powerful than any spell or ward that conventional magic could create. The approach to Godric's Hollow was accomplished through methods that demonstrated Voldemort's mastery of concealment and infiltration techniques that exceeded anything in the repertoire of ordinary dark wizards. His ability to move through protective barriers that should have been impenetrable reflected both his supernatural power and his detailed knowledge of the specific countermeasures that had been employed to secure the location, information that could only have come from someone with intimate familiarity with Order security protocols. James Potter's first awareness that their sanctuary had been compromised came not through magical alarms or detection spells, but through the simple sound of the garden gate opening when no visitors had been expected or invited. His immediate understanding of what this meant transformed him instantly from loving husband and father into a warrior prepared to sacrifice everything to buy time for his family's escape, even though he knew that escape was probably impossible given the nature of the threat they faced. The wand that James reached for in those crucial seconds represented both his readiness to fight and the tragic irony that his most powerful magical tool lay upstairs in another room, leaving him effectively defenseless against an enemy whose power was legendary, even among those who had spent years studying the dark arts. His decision to face Voldemort without proper magical protection was both heroic and futile, a gesture of defiance that could accomplish nothing except demonstrate his courage and perhaps delay the inevitable by precious seconds. Lily's immediate response to James's shouted warning was to grab their son and attempt the desperate flight upstairs that might have led to escape if apparition had been possible from within the cottage's protective barrier. The cruel irony that the same magical defenses that had kept them safe from discovery now prevented their escape when discovery had already occurred would have been apparent to her as she ran, though her maternal instincts left no room for despair or resignation in those final moments. The confrontation between James Potter and Lord Voldemort lasted only seconds, but represented everything that the war had been fought to preserve or destroy, as the young man who embodied hope and love for the future faced the creature who represented the complete absence of such qualities. James's courage in facing certain death to protect his family demonstrated the kind of heroism that Voldemort could never understand or effectively counter, even though it could not save him from the power of the killing curse cast by a wizard whose magical abilities exceeded anything that normal humans could achieve. The green light that ended James's life illuminated truths about the nature of good and evil that transcended the specific circumstances of their conflict, revealing the fundamental differences between those who would sacrifice themselves for others and those who would sacrifice others for themselves. His death was both a personal tragedy and a philosophical statement about the values that the Order of the Phoenix had been fighting to preserve throughout their long struggle against forces that acknowledged no moral constraints on their pursuit of power. Voldemort's ascent to the nursery where Lily Potter waited with her infant son was accomplished with the casual confidence of someone who had overcome the only real obstacle to achieving his objective, though his failure to understand the significance of what had already occurred would soon prove to be a fatal oversight. The magical atmosphere within the cottage had been permanently altered by James's sacrifice, creating conditions that would affect everything that followed in ways that the Dark Lord's analytical approach to magic could not anticipate or prepare for. Lily's final moments were defined by the same maternal love that had guided every decision she had made since Harry's birth, as she placed herself between her child and the most dangerous wizard who had ever lived, while knowing that her death was inevitable, but hoping that her sacrifice might somehow provide protection that conventional magic could not supply. Her refusal to stand aside when offered the chance to live demonstrated that some forms of love were stronger than the fear of death, creating magical conditions that had not been seen for centuries. The killing curse that Voldemort directed at the infant Harry Potter was cast with the same power and precision that had made it instantly fatal to thousands of victims throughout his reign of terror. Yet the magical environment created by both parents' sacrificial love had transformed the very nature of the spell's effects in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between magical power and protective forces that operated through emotional rather than intellectual channels. The love that Lily Potter felt for her son in those final seconds became something more than mere emotion, transforming into a form of magical protection that was older and more powerful than any spell that Voldemort had mastered during his decades of studying the darkest arts. Her willingness to die for someone she loved more than her own existence created barriers between the killing curse and its intended target that could not be overcome through superior magical skill or deeper knowledge of destructive technique. The moment when the curse struck Harry Potter and rebounded upon its caster marked the end of Voldemort's physical form and the beginning of a legend that would reshape the wizarding world's understanding of what was possible when love confronted power without moral constraint. The protection that his mother's sacrifice had created would persist for years, making the child untouchable by enemies who sought to complete what their master had been unable to accomplish on that Halloween night. The explosion of magical energy that accompanied Voldemort's destruction blew apart the upper floor of the cottage at Godric's Hollow, while leaving the infant Harry Potter miraculously unharmed, except for a lightning bolt scar on his forehead that would forever mark him as the boy who had survived what no one else in magical history had ever survived. The scar itself was more than mere physical damage, representing a connection between Harry and the remnant of Voldemort's soul that had been inadvertently transferred during the failed curse. The silence that followed was profound and absolute, broken only by the crying of a child who had just become the most famous wizard in the world, while simultaneously being orphaned and marked for a destiny that would define the rest of his existence. The cottage that had been a sanctuary of love and hope was now a ruin filled with the echoes of sacrifice and loss, though it also contained proof that evil, however powerful, could be defeated by forces that it could never understand or successfully counter. Hagrid's arrival at the destroyed cottage represented the beginning of the response that would transform a personal tragedy into a public celebration, as word of Voldemort's defeat spread through the wizarding world with the speed of magic itself. The half-giant's grief at discovering the bodies of James and Lily Potter was matched by his wonder at finding Harry alive and apparently unharmed, creating emotional complexity that reflected the broader community's struggle to process events that defied explanation through conventional magical theory. The decision to entrust Harry's care to his Muggle relatives rather than to magical guardians who could have provided him with knowledge and training appropriate to his heritage was based on Dumbledore's understanding that the protection created by Lily's sacrifice could be extended through blood relationships that shared her sacrifice. The charm that would keep Harry safe, as long as he could call his mother's sister's house home, was both sophisticated magic and profound irony, as it required him to live with people who despised everything magical while providing him with security that no other arrangement could have guaranteed. Sirius Black's pursuit of Peter Pettigrew through the streets of London represented both personal vengeance and desperate attempt to capture the traitor whose betrayal had made the Potter family's destruction possible. His rage at discovering the extent of Peter's treachery was matched by his grief at losing friends whose trust he had failed to protect, creating emotional storms that made rational tactical thinking impossible during the confrontation that would determine both their fates. The magical explosion that killed 12 Muggle bystanders, and allowed Peter to escape while framing Sirius for both the Potter's betrayal and the street massacre, was a masterpiece of desperate cunning that demonstrated how fear could inspire tactical brilliance in even the most cowardly individuals. Peter's transformation into his animagus form and his staged death through the severed finger that was all that remained when the dust settled represented the completion of his transformation from friend to enemy, while ensuring his survival through methods that no one would think to investigate. Sirius's capture and imprisonment in Azkaban without trial represented both a miscarriage of justice and a reflection of the chaos that followed Voldemort's defeat, as Ministry officials struggled to process the rapid succession of events that had transformed their world from terror to celebration in the space of a single night. The assumption that he must have been the secret keeper who had betrayed the Potter family was logical given the available evidence, though it demonstrated how even reasonable conclusions could be catastrophically wrong when based on incomplete information. The celebrations that erupted throughout magical Britain as news of Voldemort's defeat spread were both genuine expressions of relief and desperate attempts to believe that the nightmare that had consumed their world for over a decade was finally ended. The parties that filled every magical community from Diagon Alley to the smallest village represented not just joy at the Dark Lord's destruction, but hope that life could return to the peaceful normalcy that most people barely remembered from their youth. The name of Harry Potter was spoken with reverence and gratitude by people who had never seen the child whose survival had accomplished what the combined forces of the Order of the Phoenix and the Ministry of Magic had been unable to achieve through years of warfare. The title, The Boy Who Lived, captured both the miraculous nature of his survival and the symbolic importance of his existence as proof that love could triumph over hatred when the stakes were highest and the cost was greatest. The irony that the wizarding world's savior was a baby who would grow up ignorant of his fame and achievements was lost on most of those who celebrated his name as they focused on their relief at being free from fear, rather than considering what his victory had cost or what his future might hold. The child who had defeated the greatest dark wizard in history would spend his childhood believing himself to be unwanted and unworthy, protected by magic he could not understand while being denied knowledge of the world that owed him everything. The prophecy that had set these events in motion was fulfilled in ways that none of its original interpreters had anticipated, demonstrating that the future, while perhaps predetermined in its broad outlines, remained subject to the choices and sacrifices that individuals made when confronted with moral tests that defined their character. Harry Potter had indeed had the power to defeat Lord Voldemort, though that power had come not from his own abilities, but from his mother's love and willingness to die for him. The First Wizarding War was over, though the peace that followed would prove to be temporary rather than permanent, as the forces that had created the conflict remained largely unaddressed by Voldemort's physical destruction. The social divisions and ideological conflicts that had provided fertile ground for his rise to power would continue to fester beneath the surface of wizarding society, waiting for new leadership to mobilize them into another attempt at reshaping magical civilization according to principles that prioritized blood purity over individual worth. The child who slept peacefully in the ruins of Godric's Hollow, while the wizarding world celebrated his survival, would grow up to face challenges that his parents' sacrifice had made possible to survive, but not eliminated entirely. The scar on his forehead was both a mark of his miraculous deliverance and a promise of future conflicts that would test whether the protection born of love could endure long enough to see him through trials that were yet to come. The dawn that broke over magical Britain on November 1st, 1981, illuminated a world transformed not just by victory, but by the sudden absence of the fear that had defined daily existence for over a decade. Yet even as wizarding families emerged from hiding places and protective wards to join the celebrations that filled every magical community from London to the Scottish Highlands, those with the deepest understanding of Voldemort's organization knew that the Dark Lord's physical destruction was only the beginning of a cleanup operation that would require years to complete successfully. The Ministry of Magic, which had struggled to maintain basic governmental functions during the war's darkest periods, suddenly found itself overwhelmed by the complex task of transitioning from wartime emergency operations to something approaching normal administrative procedures. The Auror Department, whose ranks had been decimated by casualties and whose survivors bore psychological scars that would affect their effectiveness for years to come, was immediately tasked with hunting down the Death Eaters who had scattered like roaches when the light was suddenly turned on their activities. Barty Crouch Sr.'s aggressive approach to post-war justice reflected both his understanding that lenient treatment of captured Death Eaters would encourage future recruitment by similar organizations and his personal desire for revenge against those who had murdered friends and colleagues throughout the long years of conflict. The authorization for summary executions and imprisonment without trial that had been controversial even during wartime became the foundation for a systematic campaign of retribution that exceeded anything in the history of magical law enforcement. The lists of suspected Death Eaters that had been compiled during the war provided starting points for investigations that quickly revealed the true scope of Voldemort's organization and the extent to which pure-blood supremacist ideology had penetrated respectable wizarding society. Families whose public support for traditional values had seemed merely conservative were discovered to have provided financial backing and safe houses for terrorists, while individuals whose opposition to Muggle-born rights had appeared to be simple political disagreement were found to have participated in murders and torture sessions that violated every principle of civilized behavior. Mad-Eye Moody's legendary reputation reached its peak during these months of intensive hunting, as his enhanced investigative abilities and complete dedication to tracking down every remaining Death Eater made him the most feared figure among those who had served Voldemort's cause. His methods, which had been considered extreme even during wartime, were now employed against enemies who could no longer claim the protection of active military status, creating legal and ethical complications that would influence magical jurisprudence for decades to come. The capture operations that followed Voldemort's defeat were conducted with military precision and overwhelming force, as teams of Aurors surrounded suspected safe houses and strongholds with enough firepower to level entire city blocks if resistance was encountered. The shock of their master's sudden destruction had left most Death Eaters psychologically unprepared for continued conflict, making captures that might have required siege warfare during the active phase of the war relatively straightforward police operations. Igor Karkaroff's cooperation with Ministry investigators, which had begun during his wartime interrogation, expanded dramatically as he provided detailed information about Death Eater recruitment networks and operational procedures in exchange for reduced sentences and eventual freedom. His intimate knowledge of the organization's structure and personnel made him invaluable for identifying individuals who had managed to conceal their involvement during the war, though his credibility as a witness was compromised by his obvious self-interest in providing information that would secure favorable treatment. The trials that followed were conducted with unprecedented speed and harshness, as public demand for justice against those who had terrorized magical Britain for over a decade overwhelmed traditional concerns about due process and defendants' rights. The evidence that had been gathered during years of investigation was presented in proceedings that were more focused on punishment than on establishing guilt beyond reasonable doubt, creating precedents that would influence magical legal procedures long after the specific cases had been concluded. Lucius Malfoy's escape from prosecution demonstrated both the limitations of post-war justice and the continuing power of wealth and social connections to provide protection even for those whose guilt was widely suspected, if not definitively proven. His claim that he had been acting under the influence of the Imperious Curse throughout his association with Death Eater activities was supported by testimony from individuals who owed him favors or feared his retaliation, creating reasonable doubt that prosecutors could not overcome, despite evidence that suggested voluntary participation in numerous criminal activities. The Malfoy family's substantial donations to various ministry departments and charitable organizations that supported war victims created additional complications for those who sought to bring Lucius to justice, as his apparent remorse and commitment to supporting reconstruction efforts provided cover for what was essentially a sophisticated bribery campaign designed to secure immunity from prosecution. The influence that such donations provided would persist for years, affecting policy decisions and personnel appointments in ways that served Death Eater interests even after their organization's apparent destruction. The systematic search for Peter Pettigrew, who was believed to have been killed in the explosion that had claimed 12 Muggle lives, consumed enormous resources while producing no useful results, as investigators focused their efforts on finding human remains and witnesses, rather than considering the possibility that the suspected victim might have been an unregistered animagus capable of escaping detection through transformation into animal form. The assumption that he had died heroically while pursuing his friend's betrayer became accepted fact despite the absence of physical evidence that should have raised questions about the official version of events. Sirius Black's imprisonment in Azkaban without trial represented both a failure of magical justice and a reflection of the emotional climate that made careful legal procedures seem like unnecessary obstacles to achieving the retribution that public opinion demanded. The evidence against him appeared overwhelming to investigators who were unaware of the secret keeper switch that had made Peter rather than Sirius the actual traitor, while his obvious grief and rage were interpreted as signs of guilt rather than symptoms of devastating personal loss. The Dementors who guarded Azkaban prison found their duties significantly expanded as the post-war roundup filled the fortress beyond its normal capacity, creating conditions that exceeded even the deliberately harsh standards that had been established for magical criminals. The creature's presence in such numbers created an atmosphere of despair and hopelessness that affected everyone within the prison complex, making rehabilitation impossible, while ensuring that those who eventually emerged would be permanently damaged by their experiences. The most shocking revelation of the post-war period came with the discovery that Barty Crouch Jr., son of the man who had led much of the government's response to Death Eater terrorism, had himself been one of Voldemort's most dedicated followers. The younger Crouch's involvement in the torture of Frank and Alice Longbottom represented a betrayal that cut deeper than ordinary criminal activity, as it demonstrated that Death Eater recruitment had succeeded, even within families whose public service and personal sacrifice had made them symbols of resistance to Voldemort's ideology. The attack on the Longbottom family occurred barely a year after Voldemort's defeat, when the couple's success in capturing numerous Death Eaters had made them prime targets for revenge by those who remained loyal to their fallen master. Bellatrix Lestrange, Rodolphus Lestrange, Rabaston Lestrange, and Barty Crouch Jr. approached their mission with the fanatical dedication of true believers who were convinced that their master's apparent death was merely a temporary setback that could be reversed through appropriate magical intervention. The intelligence that the attackers sought from Frank and Alice Longbottom concerned not just the specific circumstances of Voldemort's defeat, but also the location of magical artifacts and research materials that might be used to restore him to physical form. Their belief that the Auror couple possessed such information reflected both their desperation to find some way of reversing their master's destruction and their fundamental misunderstanding of the magic that had actually caused his downfall. The torture session that was intended to extract this non-existent information continued for hours, beyond any reasonable expectation of producing useful results, as the attackers' fanaticism prevented them from recognizing that their victims genuinely did not possess the knowledge they sought. The Cruciatus curse that was applied with increasing intensity and duration caused permanent damage to the victims' nervous systems and cognitive functions, creating injuries that no amount of magical healing could reverse or repair. Frank and Alice's transformation from highly capable Aurors who had survived years of dangerous missions into patients whose minds had been shattered beyond any hope of recovery represented one of the war's most tragic outcomes, as their sacrifice had protected information that did not exist while destroying two of the most promising magical law enforcement officers of their generation. Their condition upon discovery made it impossible for them to provide testimony about their attackers' identities or objectives, requiring investigators to piece together the evidence from magical traces and circumstantial clues. Neville Longbottom's orphaning through his parents' permanent incapacitation created a different kind of loss than Harry Potter had experienced, as he would grow up knowing that his mother and father were alive, but unable to recognize him or provide the love and guidance that normal parents would offer their children. The visits to Street, Mungo's hospital that would mark his childhood, would be filled with the painful reality that healing magic, powerful though it was in many applications, had limits that human cruelty could exceed through systematic application of suffering. The trial of the 4 Death Eaters responsible for the Longbottom torture was conducted in the full glare of public attention, with proceedings that were broadcast throughout magical Britain to demonstrate that justice was being served against those who had committed the most heinous crimes of the post-war period. The evidence presented was overwhelming and undeniable, making the verdicts foregone conclusions while providing the wizarding public with clear examples of the kind of evil that Voldemort's ideology had fostered among his followers. Barty Crouch Sr.'s behavior during his son's trial revealed the depths of personal agony that the case had created for someone whose public career had been built upon unwavering commitment to law and order. His refusal to acknowledge any family relationship with the defendant and his demand for the harshest possible sentences reflected both his genuine revulsion at his son's crimes and his desperate attempt to distance himself from the Bia scandal that threatened to destroy everything he had accomplished during decades of public service. The younger Crouch's apparent lack of remorse for his actions and his continued expressions of loyalty to Voldemort, even in the face of life imprisonment, demonstrated the completeness of his ideological indoctrination and the psychological damage that had been caused by years of exposure to Death Eater beliefs. His behavior in court shocked even those who had witnessed the worst excesses of the war, as it revealed how thoroughly the human capacity for empathy and moral reasoning could be corrupted by sustained exposure to pure evil. The sentences imposed on all 4 defendants, life imprisonment in Azkaban, were met with public approval, despite concerns among some legal scholars that the harsh conditions in the prison constituted cruel and unusual punishment that violated basic principles of magical jurisprudence. The emotional climate created by their crimes made such objections seem like academic quibbling in the face of genuine public demand for retribution against those who had committed acts that exceeded the boundaries of civilized Behavior. The political consequences of the scandal effectively ended Barty Crouch Sr.'s career as a potential minister for magic, as his association with his son's crimes made him unelectable, despite his distinguished record of service during the war. The irony that his aggressive prosecution of Death Eaters had been undermined by his failure to detect the enemy within his own family was not lost on political observers, who understood that public confidence in his judgment had been permanently compromised. The systematic review of Death Eater trials and sentences that was conducted during this period revealed numerous cases where defendants had escaped appropriate punishment through the influence of wealth, social connections, or political influence that had been wielded behind the scenes to secure favorable outcomes. The discovery that justice had been purchased rather than earned created additional scandals that further damaged public confidence in magical legal institutions, while providing ammunition for critics who argued that the entire post-war reconciliation process had been corrupted from its inception. Severus Snape's testimony before the Wizengamot, in which he provided detailed information about Death Eater recruitment methods and organizational structure, while claiming to have been a double agent working for Dumbledore throughout the latter part of the war, was met with skepticism that reflected both the difficulty of verifying such claims and the general assumption that anyone who had served Voldemort in any capacity must have been motivated by genuine commitment to his cause, rather than more complex considerations. Dumbledore's personal guarantee of Snape's loyalty and his detailed explanation of the intelligence that the former Death Eater had provided to Order of the Phoenix operations was sufficient to secure Snape's freedom, but could not overcome the suspicion and hostility that his past associations had created among those who had lost friends and family members to Death Eater terrorism. His appointment to the Defense Against the Dark Arts position at Hogwarts was seen by many as evidence that Dumbledore's judgment had been compromised by misplaced trust in someone whose true loyalties remained questionable. The werewolf community that had been recruited by Voldemort through promises of equality and acceptance found themselves abandoned by their former allies and persecuted by authorities who viewed all lycanthropes as potential security threats regardless of their actual involvement in Death Eater activities. Fenrir Greyback's savage leadership of the werewolf faction had created associations between lycanthropy and violent extremism that would persist for decades, making it impossible for innocent werewolves to find employment or social acceptance in post-war magical society. Remus Lupin's unique position as someone whose lycanthropic condition had been known to Order of the Phoenix leadership throughout the war provided him with some protection from the general persecution that affected others with his condition, though his employment prospects remained severely limited by prejudices that associated his condition with the violence that Greyback's pack had committed in Voldemort's service. His knowledge of werewolf communities and their recruitment methods made him valuable to ongoing ministry investigations, though his cooperation with authorities created additional suspicions among lycanthropes who viewed any collaboration with government officials as betrayal of their community's interests. The giant population that had been decimated during the war's active phase remained in hiding throughout the post-war period, as their association with Death Eater forces had made them targets for continued persecution by wizards who viewed their very existence as a security threat. The few surviving giants who had not fled Britain entirely were forced to live in remote areas where their presence would not alarm civilian populations, creating conditions that made cultural preservation and reproduction nearly impossible for a species that was already on the verge of extinction. The international magical community's response to the aftermath of the First Wizarding War was characterized by relief that the conflict had been contained within British borders and reluctance to become involved in the complex process of reconstruction and reconciliation that would be required to prevent similar conflicts in the future. The isolation that this created for magical Britain would have long-term consequences for international cooperation on security issues, as other magical governments preferred to maintain distance from a country that had proven capable of producing such destructive internal conflicts. The diplomatic efforts required to maintain the Statute of Secrecy during and after the war had consumed enormous resources and created obligations to Muggle governments that would influence magical policy for decades to come. The obliviation campaigns that had been necessary to conceal magical activity from non-magical populations during the conflict's most intense phases had affected hundreds of thousands of Muggles whose memories had been modified or erased to prevent exposure of the wizarding world's existence. The economic costs of the war and its aftermath created financial pressures that affected every aspect of magical society, from individual families whose breadwinners had been killed or injured, to businesses whose operations had been disrupted by security concerns and infrastructure damage. The reconstruction efforts required to repair physical damage and restore social institutions consumed resources that might otherwise have been invested in economic growth and development, creating conditions that would affect magical Britain's prosperity for years to come. The psychological trauma that affected virtually everyone who had lived through the war created demand for healing services that the magical medical establishment was unprepared to provide, as traditional approaches to treating mental and emotional damage proved inadequate for addressing the specific types of injury that had been caused by exposure to Death Eater torture techniques and the systematic use of unforgivable curses. The Street, Mungo's hospital for magical maladies and injuries, was forced to expand its facilities and develop new treatment protocols to handle cases that exceeded anything in their previous experience. The children who had been born during the war years and those who had been too young to understand the full scope of the conflict they had lived through would carry psychological scars that would influence their worldview and behavior throughout their lives, creating generational effects that would shape magical society long after the specific events that had caused them had faded from public memory. Neville Longbottom's development as a person would be profoundly influenced by the knowledge that his parents had been destroyed by enemies whose fanaticism had exceeded the boundaries of rational criminal behavior. Harry Potter's placement with his Muggle relatives created a different kind of trauma, as the child who had saved the wizarding world was raised in ignorance of his heritage and achievements, while being subjected to neglect and emotional abuse that would have lasting effects on his personality and self-image. The protection that Dumbledore's careful planning had provided for his physical safety came at the cost of psychological development that would require healing and support throughout his eventual return to the magical world. The decade that followed Voldemort's defeat was marked by gradual recognition that the victory achieved on Halloween night 1981 had been incomplete, as many of the social and ideological conditions that had made his rise to power possible remained unaddressed by his physical destruction. The pure-blood supremacist beliefs that had provided the foundation for Death Eater recruitment continued to flourish among families and social circles that had avoided prosecution through wealth and political influence, creating the potential for future movements that could mobilize similar hatred and violence under different leadership. The institutional failures that had allowed Death Eater infiltration of the Ministry of Magic and other important magical organizations were addressed through personnel changes and security upgrades. But the underlying cultural attitudes that had made such infiltration possible proved more resistant to reform efforts. The comfortable assumption that the war's end had permanently eliminated the threat of organized dark magic would prove to be both naive and dangerous when tested by events that few could have anticipated during the celebration that followed Voldemort's apparent demise. The legend of the boy who lived began to take shape during these years of apparent peace, as Harry Potter's name became synonymous with hope and the triumph of good over evil throughout magical communities that had been shaped by fear for over a decade. The stories told about his miraculous survival would inspire children and comfort adults, though they would also create expectations and burdens that no individual should have been forced to carry, regardless of their role in historical events that had been determined as much by chance and sacrifice as by any inherent heroic qualities they might have possessed. The years that followed the First Wizarding War's conclusion were marked by a peculiar quality of silence that seemed to permeate every corner of magical Britain, as if the entire wizarding world was holding its breath while waiting for confirmation that the peace they had celebrated so joyously was indeed permanent, rather than merely a temporary respite from horrors that might yet return. This was not the comfortable quiet of genuine tranquility, but the uneasy stillness that follows earthquakes, when survivors listen for the rumbling that might herald new disasters while trying to convince themselves that the worst is truly behind them. The decade from 1984 to 1995 became known among historians as the era of cautious hope, a period when magical society attempted to rebuild not just the physical infrastructure that had been damaged during the war, but the social trust and cultural confidence that had been shattered by years of systematic terror, betrayal. The process proved far more complex and painful than anyone had anticipated, as wounds that had been inflicted on the collective psyche of Wizarding Britain resisted healing despite the best efforts of those who understood that lasting peace required more than simply the absence of active conflict. Harry Potter's childhood during these quiet years unfolded in the suffocating ordinariness of Privet Drive, where the most famous wizard in the modern world grew up believing himself to be an unwanted burden whose very existence was a source of shame and irritation to the only family he had ever known. The Dursleys' systematic campaign to suppress any manifestation of his magical heritage created a psychological environment that was perhaps more damaging than outright cruelty, as it taught him to view the most fundamental aspect of his identity as something abnormal and dangerous that needed to be hidden from civilized society. The accidental magic that occasionally erupted despite Vernon and Petunia Dursley's best efforts to contain it served only to reinforce their conviction that their nephew was fundamentally defective in ways that made normal family life impossible. The vanishing glass at the zoo, the hair that grew back overnight after disastrous haircuts, the mysterious appearance on the school roof when he was being chased by bullies. Each incident was treated as evidence of his freakish nature rather than signs of the extraordinary magical potential that would eventually reshape the wizarding world's understanding of what was possible. Dudley Dursley's transformation from merely spoiled child to actively malicious teenager provided Harry with daily reminders that his place in the family hierarchy was at the absolute bottom, below even the family cat, in terms of consideration and care. The casual cruelty that characterized their interactions was enabled and encouraged by parents who viewed Harry's unhappiness as appropriate punishment for the burden his existence placed upon their determination to live completely normal lives, free from any contamination by the magical world they had rejected so completely. The cupboard under the stairs that served as Harry's bedroom throughout his early years became a physical manifestation of his emotional isolation, a space so small and dark that it could barely contain a growing child, but which seemed appropriate to relatives who viewed his presence in their home as an unwelcome obligation that should be discharged with the minimum possible expenditure of resources or attention. The spider-infested darkness of that confined space would leave psychological marks that would influence his relationship with enclosed spaces for the remainder of his life. Meanwhile, in the magical world that remained ignorant of Harry Potter's daily reality, his name had achieved legendary status that exceeded even Voldemort's notoriety during the height of his terror campaign. The boy who lived had become more myth than person, a symbol of hope and triumph that provided comfort to people who needed to believe that good could ultimately prevail over evil, regardless of the odds or the apparent hopelessness of the situation. Books were written about his supposed childhood adventures, though none of the authors had any actual knowledge of his circumstances or experiences. The merchandising that surrounded his name created a cottage industry that flourished throughout the decade, as everything from chocolate frog cards to children's toys bore his likeness and celebrated achievements that existed primarily in the imagination of people who preferred inspiring fiction to the more complex and troubling realities of how such victories were actually won. The Harry Potter who lived in the public consciousness was a heroic figure who bore little resemblance to the lonely and confused child who was struggling to understand why his life seemed so different from everyone else's. Neville Longbottom's childhood during these same years was shaped by entirely different but equally devastating circumstances. As he grew up in the care of a grandmother whose love was genuine but whose expectations were influenced by memories of parents whose capabilities he seemed unlikely to ever match. The weekly visits to Street, Mungo's hospital, where Frank and Alice Longbottom continued their vacant existence in the Janus Thickey ward, provided constant reminders of what he had lost, while reinforcing his sense of inadequacy in the face of a family legacy that seemed impossible to honor. Augusta Longbottom's fierce determination to ensure that her grandson developed into someone worthy of his parents' sacrifice created pressures that were perhaps well-intentioned but which proved counterproductive for a child whose magical development was proceeding along timelines that did not match conventional expectations. Her demands for evidence of the kind of precocious magical ability that had characterized his parents during their youth led to increasingly desperate attempts to force manifestations that simply were not ready to appear naturally. The Remembrall incidents and other signs of Neville's apparently defective memory were actually symptoms of psychological trauma related to witnessing his parents' torture as an infant, though the magical medical establishment of the time lacked sufficient understanding of such conditions to provide appropriate diagnosis or treatment. His struggles with magic throughout his early years reflected not lack of ability, but the complex ways that emotional damage could interfere with the confidence and concentration that successful spellcasting required. The other children who had been born during the war years carried their own invisible scars, though few were as obvious or dramatic as those affecting Harry and Neville. Luna Lovegood's distinctive worldview and apparent detachment from conventional reality were shaped in part by having witnessed her mother's death in a magical accident when she was 9 years old, creating coping mechanisms that seemed eccentric to others, but which allowed her to process grief and loss in ways that were psychologically sustainable if socially isolating. Ginny Weasley's position as the youngest child and only daughter in a family that had been deeply involved in Order of the Phoenix operations meant that she absorbed stories and attitudes about the war that influenced her understanding of heroism and sacrifice long before she was old enough to comprehend their full implications. Her idealization of Harry Potter was based not just on his public reputation but on family discussions that portrayed him as the person whose survival had made their own continued existence possible. The Weasley family's financial struggles during the post-war years reflected broader economic patterns that affected many wizarding families, as the costs of reconstruction and the disruption of normal commercial activity during the conflict created conditions that made prosperity difficult to achieve, even for those who had survived the violence without direct physical harm. Arthur Weasley's modest position within the Ministry of Magic provided security but not wealth, requiring careful management of resources that left little room for the kind of expenses that other families might consider routine. Molly Weasley's fierce protectiveness of her children was intensified by memories of losing her brothers during the war, creating a household atmosphere that emphasized family loyalty and mutual support while sometimes stifling the independence that growing children naturally sought. Her cooking and caregiving became expressions of love that were almost desperate in their intensity, as if she could prevent future losses through the sheer force of maternal attention and nurturing. The magical education system that was preparing this generation of children for their eventual entry into adult wizarding society had been modified to address some of the security concerns that had been highlighted during the war, though the changes were often more symbolic than substantive. Hogwarts' School of Witchcraft and Wizardry remained fundamentally unchanged in its educational philosophy and methods, despite growing recognition that the challenges facing young witches and wizards were evolving in ways that traditional instruction might not adequately address. Professor McGonagall's advancement to deputy headmistress reflected both her exceptional capabilities as an educator and administrator, and Dumbledore's recognition that the school needed leadership that combined academic excellence with practical understanding of the defense requirements that might be necessary if threats similar to those of the recent war were to emerge again. Her stern but fair approach to student discipline provided stability that helped normalize the school environment while maintaining standards that prepared students for the responsibilities they would eventually face. Professor Snape's position as Potions Master created ongoing controversies that reflected broader questions about how former Death Eaters should be integrated into post-war magical society. His obvious competence as an educator was balanced against concerns about whether someone with his background should be entrusted with the education of children, especially those from families that had been targeted by Voldemort's organization. His harsh teaching methods and apparent favoritism towards Slytherin students were seen by critics as evidence that his loyalty remained questionable despite Dumbledore's continued support. The defense against the dark arts position continued to experience the rapid turnover that had characterized it since Voldemort's curse was placed upon it, creating an educational environment that made it difficult for students to receive consistent instruction in what many considered to be the most important subject in the curriculum given recent events. The parade of temporary instructors who occupied the position ranged from competent but overwhelmed to completely inadequate, reflecting the curse's ability to ensure that no one could successfully fulfill the role for more than a single academic year. Dumbledore's leadership during these years was marked by a combination of public visibility as the wizard who had defeated Grindelwald and guided the resistance against Voldemort, and private activities that remained mysterious even to his closest associates. His membership in the International Confederation of Wizards and his various ceremonial positions provided him with platforms for promoting international cooperation and magical education reform, while his continued research into advanced magical theory kept him at the forefront of developments that might be relevant to future security challenges. The Order of the Phoenix had been officially dissolved following Voldemort's defeat, though informal networks of communication and mutual support continued to exist among former members who understood that their shared experiences had created bonds that transcended normal, professional, or social relationships. The knowledge that they had been willing to die for causes larger than themselves created a sense of responsibility and vigilance that persisted long after the immediate threats that had brought them together had been eliminated. Mad-Eye Moody's retirement from active Auror duty marked the end of an era in magical law enforcement, though his legendary reputation continued to influence training methods and operational procedures throughout the department. His transition to a more advisory role was complicated by psychological conditions that made normal social interaction difficult, as years of justified paranoia had created mental habits that were impossible to abandon, even when the threats that had necessitated them no longer existed. The detection devices and security innovations that had been developed during the war found peacetime applications that influenced everything from ministry security procedures to the protective measures implemented at Gringotts Bank, other institutions that handled valuable magical materials. The enhanced vigilance that had been necessary for survival during the conflict gradually evolved into routine precautions that became accepted parts of daily life, despite their origins in desperate wartime necessity. The international magical community's response to the aftermath of the First Wizarding War reflected both relief that the conflict had been contained and concern about the precedents that had been established for dealing with dark magic on such a scale. The methods that had been employed by both sides during the conflict raised questions about the boundaries of acceptable magical practice that would influence international magical law for decades to come. The Statute of Secrecy had been severely tested during the war years, requiring extensive cooperation between magical and Muggle governments to prevent exposure of the wizarding world's existence to non-magical populations that were unprepared to understand or accept such revelations. The protocols that had been developed for managing such crises became models for similar situations in other countries, though the hope was that such extreme measures would never again be necessary. The economic recovery that began during the mid-1980s was driven largely by reconstruction efforts that created employment opportunities, while also stimulating innovation in magical technology and services. The businesses that had survived the war years by adapting to security challenges and changed consumer behavior were often better positioned to prosper during peacetime than those that had struggled to maintain traditional operations. Despite altered circumstances, Diagon Alley's restoration as the commercial heart of magical Britain required not just physical reconstruction, but restoration of public confidence that shopping and social activities could be conducted safely without fear of attack or infiltration by hostile forces. The gradual return of crowds and normal commercial activity provided visible evidence that life was returning to something approaching pre-war normalcy, though many businesses implemented security measures that would have been unthinkable during more innocent times. The publishing industry that had been severely restricted during the war years experienced a renaissance as demand for entertainment and information that had been suppressed during the conflict created markets for everything from popular fiction to serious historical analysis of recent events. The books that attempted to document and explain the war's causes and consequences provided forums for debates about responsibility and prevention that would continue for years to come. The Daily Prophet and other magical news publications struggled to adapt to peacetime reporting after years of wartime censorship and propaganda, as readers demanded more comprehensive coverage of events, while authorities remained reluctant to abandon information controls that had been deemed necessary for security purposes. The balance between press freedom and responsible reporting became a subject of ongoing controversy that reflected broader questions about the appropriate relationship between government and media in democratic magical societies. The children who would eventually attend Hogwarts during the 1990s were growing up in a world that appeared peaceful, but which carried the invisible scars of recent trauma in ways that influenced family dynamics and social expectations. Parents who had survived the war were often overprotective of offspring whose safety had been purchased through sacrifices that could never be forgotten or fully repaid. The magical creatures that had been recruited by both sides during the conflict remained marginalized by post-war policies that viewed their wartime activities as evidence of inherent unreliability rather than responses to circumstances that had offered them few alternatives. The werewolf registration requirements and giant relocation programs reflected continued suspicion about the loyalty of non-human magical beings that would persist long after the specific threats that had justified such measures had been eliminated. The house elves, whose labor supported much of magical society, remained largely invisible to the general population, though some activists began questioning whether the conditions of their service were compatible with the values of equality and justice that the war had supposedly been fought to preserve. These early discussions of magical creature rights would eventually evolve into more comprehensive reform movements. Though significant changes would require decades of patient advocacy and education, the memories of those who had died during the conflict were preserved through memorials and ceremonies that attempted to honor their sacrifice while providing comfort to survivors who needed to believe that such losses had served purposes larger than the immediate tactical advantages they might have provided. The names inscribed on monuments throughout magical Britain represented not just individual tragedies, but collective recognition that freedom required prices that each generation might be called upon to pay. The quiet years were drawing to a close as Harry Potter's 11th birthday approached, and the magical world prepared for the return of someone whose fame exceeded his understanding of his own identity and destiny. The peace that had been purchased through such enormous sacrifice was about to be tested by new challenges that would require the same courage and determination that had characterized the previous generation's response to existential threats. The stage was being set for revelations and confrontations that would demonstrate whether the lessons of the First Wizarding War had been learned well enough to prevent the mistakes that had made such a conflict possible. The children who had grown up in the shadows of their parents' heroism would soon face tests that would determine whether they possessed the moral clarity and personal courage necessary to continue the eternal vigilance that freedom demanded from each successive generation. Rest now, young wizard, as our tale of the First Wizarding War draws to its peaceful close. In the darkness of that terrible conflict, we witnessed how love proved stronger than death, how sacrifice could triumph over selfishness, and how even in the deepest shadow, light endures. The war that began with one boy's choice to embrace darkness ended with another's protection through his mother's love. As you drift toward dreams, remember that this tale, though filled with sorrow, speaks to the power of those who choose to stand against evil, no matter the cost. Sleep well, knowing that even in our darkest hours, there are always those willing to fight for what is right, and that sometimes the smallest act of love can change the world forever. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be peaceful under stars that witnessed both the rise and fall of darkness.